Hey, welcome back, friend. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Wherever you are right now, lying in bed, curled up on the couch, maybe sneaking in one last listen before your eyes finally give in. I want you to know you picked a good night to slow down. Because tonight, we're going somewhere most history books barely scratch the surface of. We're not visiting kings. We're not watching knights ride into battle. Tonight, we're stepping onto a dirt road. A long, muddy, impossibly alive dirt road in the heart of medieval Europe. And I promise you, what happened on that road is one of the most fascinating, most human stories you've never been told. Picture this. It is the year 1240. The sun hasn't fully risen yet over the hills of northern France, and already, there is someone on the road. A merchant hunched under a wool cloak, leading a donkey loaded with bolts of linen. Behind him, two pilgrims carrying wooden staffs and chanting softly under their breath. And coming from the opposite direction, a young woman selling eggs from a basket on her head, her feet bare on the cold earth, heading to the market town 6 miles away. Three completely different people. Three completely different lives. One road. And here's the thing that might surprise you. This wasn't rare. This was every single morning. Now, before we go any further on this road together, I just want to say if you're enjoying what I bring you here, it genuinely means the world to me when you hit that subscribe button, drop a like, or even just leave a little comment down below. I read them, all of them, and I love hearing from you where you're listening from, what time it is, what made you click on this video tonight. So, whenever you feel moved to do it, go right ahead now. Dim the lights if you can. Let the night sounds settle around you, and let's walk this road together. Here's something most people, even people who love history, get completely wrong about the Middle Ages. They imagine a world that was quiet, isolated, where peasants were born, lived, and died within a few miles of the same patch of earth, never knowing what lay beyond the next hill. A world where the roads were empty except for the occasional knight on horseback or a royal messenger galloping past in a cloud of dust. And honestly, that image is so wrong. It's almost funny because the truth is medieval trade roads were never quiet. Not for long. Historians and archaeologists have pieced together a picture that would genuinely shock most people today. By the 13th century, the road network connecting northern Europe to the Mediterranean was one of the most active human arteries on Earth. Think about that for a second. Not the internet, not rail lines, dirt roads. Dirt roads that carried the economic engine of an entire civilization. In the early 13th century, the city of Genoa, alone, one Italian port city, had 198 resident foreign merchants living within its walls. Of those, 95 were Flemish, and 51 were French. These weren't tourists. These are people who had walked, sailed, and stumbled hundreds of miles just to be closer to where the goods were moving. That's not a quiet world. That's a world buzzing with motion, ambition, and the smell of unwashed wool and spiced wine. Now let's talk about why. Why were these roads so alive? Because of a very simple, very human truth. People have always needed things they couldn't make themselves. In medieval Europe, that need became a kind of organized chaos. A farmer in England could grow all the grain he wanted, but he couldn't grow pepper. He couldn't grow silk. He couldn't mine silver or press olive oil, or distill the kind of medicines that might save his child's life in winter. Those things had to come from somewhere else. And the only way to get them from somewhere else was to put them on a road. A man's back, a donkey's back, a cart's 2 creaking wooden wheels, and send them across hundreds of miles of mud forest and mountain passes to wherever they were needed. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because by the time the High Middle Ages were in full swing, we're talking roughly the 11th through the 13th centuries, this wasn't just casual trade anymore. This was a system, a living, breathing, deeply interconnected system that stretched from the wool fields of England all the way to the spice markets of Alexandria and beyond. English wool, raw, heavy smelling of sheep, was shipped across the channel to the weavers of Flanders in what is now Belgium and northern France. Those weavers turned it into fine cloth. That cloth was then loaded onto carts and hauled south across France, over the Alps into the Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Florence. There, Italian merchants traded it for silks and spices that had come up from the Middle East. Those silks and spices then made their way back north through the same roads, past the same toll gates, into the hands of nobles and wealthy merchants who would pay almost anything to have them. One bolt of cloth, one bag of pepper, crossing half a continent. That is what these roads carried. And it wasn't just goods. This is the part that really gets me. These roads carried stories. They carried languages. They carried songs. They carried diseases, which we'll talk about later. And it's a dark chapter. I'll warn you now. But they also carried medical knowledge, astronomical discoveries, new farming techniques, and mathematical ideas that would eventually give birth to modern science. The same road that carried a merchant's bag of nutmeg also carried a scholar's copy of Aristotle, translated into Latin from an Arabic manuscript making its way from Toledo in Spain to Paris. Every footstep on those roads was a thread in a tapestry so enormous that most people living it couldn't even see its full shape. But let's bring this back down to earth, because I don't want you to picture these roads as some grand romantic highway. The reality was considerably more muddy. Before we get into all the people who walked these roads, the merchants, the pilgrims, the innkeepers, the bandits, the women who kept the whole thing running, I want to give you one number that puts everything in perspective. Before the year 1300, most ordinary people never traveled more than a few miles from home. Most peasant women were known to walk up to 12 miles to reach a market town, 12 miles on foot in shoes that, according to surviving accounts, wore through in about a month of regular walking. And they did it anyway, because what was waiting at the end of those 12 miles, a market affair, a chance to sell what they'd made and buy what they needed, was worth every blister. Now, here's what I really want you to sit with tonight as we begin this journey together. These roads didn't just exist to move goods. They existed because human beings are restless. They are curious. They are hungry not just for bread, but for connection, for something new, for proof that the world is bigger than the village they were born in. The medieval trade road was in its own muddy, dangerous, deeply imperfect way a monument to that hunger. Every person who stepped onto it was making a bet that the road ahead was worth the road beneath their feet. And for hundreds of years, enough people kept making that bet to keep the whole thing alive. Now, here's what I want you to think about as we move into the next part of our story tonight. We've talked about why these roads existed, the economics, the hunger, the scale of it all. But we haven't yet talked about what it was actually like to stand on one of those roads, to feel it under your feet, to understand just how rough, how treacherous, and honestly, how completely terrible the infrastructure of a medieval trade road actually was. Because here's the thing. The Romans left behind these magnificent paved highways stretching straight as arrows across the whole continent. And you might assume that the medieval world simply used them, maintained them, built upon them. And the answer to that assumption is complicated, in ways that are going to surprise you, in ways that are going to make you look at every pothole in your street tonight and feel just a little bit grateful. So let's keep going. The road is right ahead of us, and it is nothing like you're imagining. So we left off standing at the edge of that road, and I told you it was nothing like you were imagining. Let me prove it. Close your eyes for just a second. And I mean that genuinely, not the way narrators say it when they just want a dramatic pause. Actually close them. Now, picture the best road you know. Maybe it's the highway you take to work, smooth asphalt painted lines, 2 lanes going each direction. Or maybe it's a quiet country road, still paved, still predictable. Whatever you're seeing, erase it completely. Because what the people of medieval Europe walked on was something so fundamentally different that the word road barely does it justice. Here's the first thing you need to understand. The Romans, bless them, had left behind something magnificent. 80,000 m of engineered roads stretching across Europe and beyond. Not just dirt tracks, actual engineered roads 3 feet deep, packed with crushed stone at the bottom for drainage, layered with smaller gravel, topped with hand-cut stone pavers, often pentagonal, fitted together like a puzzle, sloped ever so slightly from the center, so that rainwater would roll off into ditches on either side, straight as arrows, because Roman engineers surveyed every route before a single stone was placed. Built for legions of soldiers to march 20th a day in formation without losing their footing. That's what the Romans built. And by around the year 180, that entire network was mostly complete. It was genuinely one of the greatest feats of civil engineering the ancient world ever produced. So, you'd think, right, that when the Middle Ages rolled in, people would have simply continued using those roads, maintained them, loved them, and in some places they did. In the year 1066, when King Harold II made his legendary forced march from York down to the south coast of England to meet William's invasion, he was traveling on Roman roads that were still usable 900 years after they were built. 900 years. Let that sink in. But here's where it gets genuinely surprising. In many other places, archaeological evidence tells a different story. Medieval carts and wagons were often found to have deliberately avoided the old Roman paved surfaces. Not because travelers didn't know the roads were there, but because the ancient stone pavers, after centuries of frost and rain and roots pushing up from below, had become treacherous, uneven, slippery when wet. A horse could break a leg on a shifted stone that no longer sat flush with its neighbor. So instead, new dirt tracks formed running right alongside the old Roman roads, parallel to them, ghost roads walking next to their ancient ancestors. And over time, those new dirt tracks were worn deeper and deeper by the constant passage of feet and wheels until they became what historians call hollowways, sunken lanes carved into the earth itself, sometimes 8 or 10 feet below the surrounding landscape. If you've ever walked through the English countryside and found yourself in a lane that feels like a tunnel with hedgerows towering above you on both sides and the sky just a narrow strip overhead, you might have been standing in a hollowway that medieval merchants walked 700 years ago. But let's talk about what those roads were actually like to travel, because the hollowways are almost the romantic part. The real conditions on a medieval trade road were something else entirely. There's a French legal text from the late 13th century called the Codum de Beauve, basically a comprehensive rule book for how things should work in the Beau region of France, and one of the things it spends considerable energy on specifically complaining about people who are stealing the wooden planks laid over the worst sections of muddy roads, because apparently it was common enough to be a legal problem. People would haul away the planks to use as building material, and then the next traveler would arrive at what was supposed to be a passable stretch of road and find themselves staring at a pit of mud. That's your medieval road system in a sentence. Honestly, someone always stole the planks. And then there was winter. Oh, winter. During the winter of 1395 to 96, and this is documented, the route between the towns of Menin and Lille in what is now northern France became so completely impossible from mud and slush that it was simply closed. Not repaired, closed. Travelers who absolutely had to get through would leave the road entirely and cut across farmers' fields, destroying crops they had no legal right to destroy because there was simply no other option. The road had ceased to exist. Now I want to ask you something, because I genuinely find this fascinating, and I think you might too. If the roads were this bad, and they were, how on earth did anyone decide how long a journey would take? How did a merchant in London plan his trip to a trade fair in Champagne? How did he know when to set out, or whether he'd arrive at all? The answer tells you everything about the medieval relationship with travel. It was not a science. It was closer to a negotiation between ambition and weather, between urgency and the state of the last bridge you'd heard about from the last traveler coming the other way. Here's what the numbers actually look like based on surviving records and accounts. A man traveling on foot alone in good conditions could cover around 25 to 30 m in a day. That sounds reasonable. That's roughly the distance from Washington District of Columbia to Baltimore on foot every day for weeks. If you had a horse and you were careful with it, meaning you didn't push it to the point of injury, you might manage 20 to 25 m a day on a long journey. Not much faster than walking when you account for the horse's needs. Rich officials who could afford to change horses at intervals along the route could push to 30 or 40 m a day. And in rare urgent cases, a professional royal messenger changing horses every few hours could cover 50 to 60 m. But a loaded trade cart pulled by horses through normal road conditions in summer, about 12 miles a day. In winter, 5 to 8 m, 5 m in a full day of travel. And I want to put that in concrete terms because 12 miles a day doesn't feel very shocking until you apply it to a real journey. In the year 1297, Margaret, the newlywed Duchess of Brabant, decided to have her entire wardrobe, her full clothing collection, transported from London to her new home. It took the carts 18 days to cover the first 85 miles. From London to Ipswich, 85 miles. 18 days. And this was not a budget operation. Those carts were pulled by 5 horses. 5 horses to move what was essentially a royal wardrobe at a speed that a determined person could have walked in 3 days. And yet, and this is the thing that I keep coming back to, people did it anyway. Every day, merchants with donkeys, women with baskets, scholars with saddlebags full of manuscripts, monks on their way between monasteries, pilgrims with wooden staffs and blisters on their feet. All of them on these roads that were too muddy in winter, too dusty and rooted in summer, too treacherous in rain, and too frozen to navigate in deep cold. And nobody thought this was particularly strange. It was just life. You planned around the seasons. You traveled in summer when you could, and you accepted that certain routes were simply not possible between November and March. You left early in the morning to maximize daylight hours. You watched the sky. You asked every traveler coming toward you what the conditions were like ahead. Was the bridge at the crossing still standing? Was there mud past the last village? Or had it dried out? Had anyone seen trouble on the road past the forest? The road wasn't just infrastructure. It was a conversation, a constant living exchange of information between everyone on it. And speaking of the people you might meet on those roads, there was one detail about medieval travel that I think is deeply underappreciated. The medieval traveler almost never traveled alone if they could help it. Not because medieval people were especially sociable, though many of them were, but because traveling alone was genuinely dangerous in a way that's hard to fully grasp today. We'll talk about the specific dangers of the road in a later part of our story tonight. The bandits, the wolves, the very unhelpful nobles who sometimes ran their own protection rackets. But what I want you to hold on to right now is the social texture of a medieval trade road. Because these people weren't just passing each other. They were traveling together for days at a time, sharing fires at night, sharing food, sharing information. A wool merchant from England walking south toward the Alpine passes might fall in with a group of Flemish cloth traders for 3 days across northern France. They didn't speak the same language fluently necessarily. They might gesture more than speak, use the handful of common words every seasoned traveler picked up along the way. But they walked the same road. They shared the same anxiety about the weather. They sat around the same fire and pointed in the direction of the road ahead with the same concerned expression. There is something deeply human about that. Something that makes the medieval trade road feel less like ancient history and more like, well, like any bus station, any airport, any place where strangers thrown together by the same destination become briefly a kind of community. You know, whenever I sit with this part of the story, the physical reality of what it meant to travel these roads, I always come back to the shoes of a medieval traveler, because the footwear of this era wore through, according to historical records, in about a month of regular hard walking. A month. And most people could not simply buy new shoes the way we'd stop for new trainers at a store. Shoes were expensive. Leather was expensive. Cobbling was expensive. So travelers mended their shoes on the road. They stuffed them with cloth. They wrapped cloth around their feet, inside them, when the sole was thin. They arrived at their destination with feet that historians examining skeletons from this period have described as visibly deformed from a lifetime of walking bent. Toes, thickened heel bones, stress fractures healed and rehealed. The medieval road lived in the bodies of the people who walked it long after the journey was over. So, we've walked the road together now in a sense. We felt the mud, counted the miles, understood the negotiations between weather and willpower. But here's what we haven't touched yet. And this is where the story gets really rich. We've been talking about the physical road, the ground beneath the feet, but we haven't yet talked about the person whose whole life was built around that road. The person who got up every morning before dawn, loaded a donkey or shouldered a pack, and made a career, a life, a reputation, sometimes a small fortune out of moving things from where they were made to where they were needed. The medieval merchant. And the story of who that person really was, where they came from, what they carried, what they risked, what drove them forward through all of it is quite unlike anything you've probably been taught. Because the romantic image of the wealthy merchant in fine fur and a large house, that was only ever the end of the story. The beginning looked very, very different. Let's go there next. There's a man I want to tell you about tonight. His name was Godric, and I think about him more than I probably should for someone who died over 850 years ago. He was born around the year 1065 in Walpole, a small coastal village in Norfolk, England. His parents were Anglo-Saxon peasants described in the records as people of slender rank and wealth, but abundant in righteousness and virtue, which is a very gracious medieval way of saying they were poor and good people. And by all expectations of his time, Godric should have grown up to be exactly what his father was, a farmer. A man who worked the same strip of earth from childhood to old age, who never ventured more than a day's walk from the place he was born, who measured the seasons by the turning of crops and the heaviness of mud. That is what his world expected of him. That is not what happened. As a young man, still a teenager by some accounts, Godric chose the road, not metaphorically, literally. He packed whatever small goods he could carry or afford, loaded them onto a pack animal, and began walking village to village through Lincolnshire and Norfolk, selling things, thread, small household tools, whatever people in remote farmsteads needed and couldn't easily get themselves. He was in the language of the timer peddler, the lowest rung of the merchant world, the person who did the unglamorous, exhausting, poorly paid work of getting inexpensive things to people who lived far from any town. And I want to pause here for a moment, because I think this detail is easy to pass over, and it absolutely should not be. A peddler in medieval Europe was not a romantic figure. There was no mystique to it, no adventure really. You were on foot or with a donkey. You were cold in winter and muddy in spring. You were often treated with mild suspicion by the villagers you visited, because a stranger appearing at the edge of a small community with a pack of goods was not automatically trusted. You earned very little. You spent most of what you earned on food and shelter, and you did it again the next day. That was the beginning of the merchant's life for most people who lived it. Not silk and spices, mud and thread. But here is what I find genuinely extraordinary about Godric, and about hundreds of people like him whose names we'll never know. He was paying attention. All those years of walking, all those conversations with farmers and craftsmen and the occasional traveling monk, all that slow accumulation of understanding about what people needed, where things were cheap and where they were dear, how the prices shifted between one region and the next. It was a kind of education that no university in the 12th century could have given him, an education in the living geography of desire and scarcity. And Godric used it. Within a few years, he had expanded his routes. Then he found his way to the coast, then to ships. By his mid-30s, Godric of Finchale, the peasant boy who had started with a donkey and a pack of thread, was a part owner and captain of merchant vessels sailing between England, Scotland, Denmark, and Flanders. Some historians believe he may have been the captain of the ship that carried Baldwin I, the first Christian king of Jerusalem, to the port of Jaffa in the year 112. That is the same Godric, peddler ship captain in about 2 decades. Now, I don't want you to think this was common. It wasn't. Most peddlers stayed peddlers. Most small merchants never made it past a certain level of the trade. But Godric's story is useful precisely because it shows us the full spectrum of what the merchant's life could look like from its humblest beginning to its most extraordinary possibilities. And it raises a question I find fascinating. What actually drove someone like Godric forward? What kept someone walking those frozen roads in winter, sleeping in barns, eating whatever was cheap year after year? Was it greed? Was it ambition? Or was it something harder to name? Something closer to what I call the itch of a curious mind that simply could not stay still? Because here's what the historical record actually tells us about medieval merchants as a class. The church, the dominant moral authority of medieval Europe, was deeply suspicious of them, not of peddlers specifically, of merchants in general. The whole concept of buying something for one price and selling it for more sat uncomfortably with medieval Christian theology. The theologians had a word for the profit motive. They called it cupidity. And cupidity was considered, to put it plainly, not great for your soul. There was a Latin saying that circulated in church writings for centuries. It translated roughly as "the merchant can scarcely please God." Think about that. The person who physically connected your village to the rest of the world. The person who brought you pepper for your food and wool for your coat and the medicine your child needed. Scarcely able to please God because he made a profit doing it. And yet merchants existed. They thrived. They built some of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe because the world needed them regardless of what any theologian wrote. Let's talk about what a successful merchant actually did on a practical level, because it was considerably more complex than just buying cheap and selling dear. By the 12th and 13th centuries, merchants operating along the major trade routes had developed a genuinely sophisticated set of tools for managing money and risk. Here's one that should sound familiar. A wealthy investor in Genoa, someone who had capital but didn't want to walk to Constantinople personally, which is frankly understandable, would enter into a contract with the traveling merchant. This contract was called a commander, and the way it worked was elegant in its simplicity. The investor provided all the capital. The traveling merchant provided the labor, the expertise, and the risk of their own body on the road. If the venture succeeded, the investor took 3/4 of the profit. The traveling merchant kept 1/4 plus whatever he had put in personally. If the venture failed, if the goods were lost to weather or theft or a bad market, the investor lost his capital, but the traveling merchant was not personally destroyed. His liability was limited to what he had personally contributed. Sound familiar? It should. That structure: investor provides capital, active partner provides labor, and expertise, profits split by pre-agri ratio liability. Limited is the direct ancestor of the modern limited liability company, the modern private equity fund, the modern venture capital arrangement. Medieval Genoese merchants invented it because they needed a way to let poor but talented people participate in high-stakes trade without the risk of one bad voyage destroying them completely. And in Genoese notarial archives from 1154 to 1315, historians have found records of more than 8,400 such sea venture contracts. More than 8,000 in one city over roughly a century and a half. That is not casual commerce. That is the systematic, sophisticated construction of a financial ecosystem. And I think this is one of the things that genuinely surprises people when they look closely at medieval trade. We tend to imagine the Middle Ages as a time of barter and simplicity, of people exchanging one physical thing for another at a muddy market stall. And yes, that happened. But by the 13th century, the financial architecture of European trade had grown into something that would be recognizable and frankly impressive to any modern business person. The merchants carried letters of credit, written documents issued by a banking house in one city, guaranteeing that the bearer could draw funds from a corresponding bank in another city. So, a merchant traveling from Florence to the trade fairs of Champagne didn't have to carry a sack of gold coins through the mountain passes of the Alps. He carried a letter, light, portable, worthless to a thief who couldn't read, and backed by a network of trust between banking families that stretched across the whole continent. Think about what that actually required. Not just business infrastructure, not just clever contract law, but a web of human relationships, of reputation, of trust, earned over years and generations, that functioned as the invisible architecture beneath the visible world of goods and roads. But let me bring this back to the ground, back to the dust and the blisters. Because for every Godric who rose from peddler to ship captain, for every Genoese investor financing expeditions to Constantinople, there were thousands of ordinary merchants who spent their entire careers in the middle distance. Not glamorous, not impoverished, just working, moving wool from one market to the next, buying cheap in one town and selling dear in the next. Carefully, methodically, constantly alert to the shifting prices that a merchant needed to know the way a farmer knew the weather. And what I find deeply human about them is this. They had families, their wives, and we'll talk more about women in a later part of our story. Because the women of the trade road deserve their own chapter, managed the business at home, while husbands were gone for weeks or months at a time. They had apprentices, usually boys in their early teens, who walked beside them learning the trade. They had loyalties and friendships with other merchants on the same routes. They had perhaps most importantly a code, not a written one necessarily, but the understanding that your reputation was your most valuable asset, that a merchant who cheated once might profit once, but a merchant who was known as honest could expect to find credit, shelter, and favorable treatment from other merchants anywhere on the road. Your word in the medieval merchant world was literally money. Does that remind you of anything? I keep coming back to this when I think about medieval commerce. The way reputation functioned as currency. The way trust networks held entire financial systems together in the absence of any central authority. The way a person of low birth could, through intelligence and tenacity and the willingness to put their body on a difficult road, build something out of nothing. It's not so different from the world we live in. The mechanisms are different. The distances are compressed. The dangers are different in kind. But the underlying human logic, build a reputation, earn trust, leverage that trust to reach further than you started, has not changed in 7 centuries. And Godric, he ended his story in the strangest possible way for a successful merchant. He gave it all up. In his 40s, after the pilgrimages and the sailing and the years on every road and sea route between England and the Mediterranean, he walked to a small piece of woodland beside a river near Durham. He built a hut with a turf roof. He slept on the ground with a stone as his pillow. He ate herbs and wild honey and crab apples. He lived that way for 60 years, advising kings and popes who came to seek his counsel, writing songs. Some of the oldest English language songs with surviving musical notation in fact, and speaking in his old age, with utter contentment about the road, not with regret, with gratitude. He had seen more of the world than almost any person of his time and social class had any right to see. He had stood on the docks of Flanders and smelled the sea air of Denmark and navigated the trade routes of the Mediterranean, and he had chosen, in the end, to sit still. That strikes me as one of the most quietly profound things about the medieval merchant life. It gave you the world. What you did with that gift was entirely your own. Now, so much of what we've talked about, the ambition, the risk, the financial innovation, was lived out against a very specific backdrop. Not just the roads themselves, but the system that controlled those roads. A system of checkpoints, fees, and power that every single merchant, from the smallest peddler to the wealthiest ship owner, had to navigate every single day. The toll system of medieval Europe was one of the most consequential and most maddeningly complicated structures ever built around the act of simply trying to get from one place to another. And some of what happened at those toll gates would make you genuinely furious, even 800 years later. Let's talk about it next. All right, let's talk about something that I think would make even the most patient person on earth quietly lose their mind. Picture yourself as a merchant in the year 1260. You have loaded your goods. You have said goodbye to your family. You have prepared mentally for weeks of difficult travel. The mud, the cold, the bad inns, the unpredictable weather. You think you know what you're walking into. And then you get to the River, the great artery of trade through the heart of Europe, the highway that connected the merchant cities of the south to the ports of the north. And on that single stretch of river, over the course of its long history of medieval commerce, 79 different locations served as toll collection points. 79 over roughly 1,000 years, from around the year 800 to the year 1800. Various lords, princes, archbishops, and occasionally individuals who could generously be described as operating outside legal norms. All of them set up stations and demanded payment from every boat and cargo ship that tried to get through. And this wasn't some distant historical oddity. This was the beating commercial heart of medieval Europe. Every barrel of wine going north, every bale of wool going south, every shipment of spices, every load of timber, all of it had to pass through that gauntlet. Now, let me be precise here because the full picture matters. At any given moment in the medieval period, the Rhine didn't have all 79 stations operating simultaneously. That would have been essentially impossible to navigate. But during the worst years, and there were worst years, and we'll get to them, the number of active toll points on the river reached levels that made trade almost physically unsustainable. The way the system was supposed to work was actually fairly reasonable on paper. Only the Holy Roman Emperor could authorize a legitimate toll station. The right was granted to specific lords, princes, and powerful churchmen. Yes, archbishops collected Rin tolls, which is a detail that never stops being slightly surreal to me as a form of income and a way to fund infrastructure. A toll station at Koblenz, one of the most documented in history, received its imperial authorization in the year 1018 and operated in one form or another for centuries. The fee structure for legitimate tolls was specific. On the bridge at Avignon in France, for example, one of the most famous medieval bridges in Europe, the recorded toll was 2 dinars, that is 2 small copper coins for a horse and rider. For deniers for a wagon, half a denier for a donkey, a cow, or a sheep. Reasonable, predictable, the kind of cost a merchant could account for when calculating whether a journey was worth making. But here's where it unravels. And here's where the story of medieval tolls becomes genuinely one of the more maddening episodes in the history of commerce. Medieval Europe did not have a unified government. It had hundreds of local authorities, lords, dukes, counts, bishops, abbots, city councils, each of them controlling some stretch of road or river or mountain pass. And each of them had noticed something very useful. If you sat a chope one on a trade route, you didn't need to produce anything. You didn't need to grow crops. You didn't need to make anything. You just needed a chain. An actual iron chain stretched across a river, or a gate across a road, or a tower with guards on a bridge. And every single merchant who needed to get past would pay. The incentives were, shall we say, not well aligned with the interests of trade. The Rhine River is the clearest and most documented example of what happened when this logic was allowed to run unchecked. The Frankish Emperor Charlemagne had back in the early 9th century tried to establish rules. His capitulary, essentially an imperial decree from the year 85, spelled out in what was presumably a tone of imperial exasperation, which tolls were legitimate and which were not. A legitimate toll payment for crossing a bridge where the tradition of payment was already established. An illegitimate toll, charging someone for simply passing on a road or through a forest or crossing under a bridge. This was a man who was genuinely trying to prevent the abuse of the system. The problem was Charlemagne died, and after him came centuries of smaller, weaker rulers, political fragmentation, regional power struggles, and the slow, steady proliferation of toll points wherever any lord could get away with it. The worst period came in the middle of the 13th century. Between the years 1250 and 1273, the Holy Roman Empire went through what historians call the Great Interregnum. The Interregnum was a period of approximately 23 years during which there was no recognized emperor, no central authority, no one with the power and legitimacy to regulate who could and could not collect tolls. And the results were, to put it plainly, catastrophic for trade. The number of toll stations on the Rhine exploded. Minor lords who had never had the legal right to collect tolls simply started collecting tolls. They stretched chains across the river. They stationed armed men on the banks. They demanded payment. And if you didn't pay, the historical record uses the term robritta in English robber knights. These were technically noblemen, but they operated in ways that would be difficult to distinguish from organized theft. They seized cargoes. They impounded entire ships. Some of them held merchants for ransom. Let me give you a moment to just sit with that image. You're a cloth merchant from Flanders. You've loaded your boat with fine woolen cloth. Weeks of careful preparation, a significant investment. You're heading south along the Rhine toward the Italian trade fairs where you expect to sell it at a good profit. And somewhere in the middle of the Rhine Valley, a chain rises out of the water in front of your boat. Armed men appear on the bank, and a man who calls himself a knight, who is technically a lord of the land on either side of the river, demands that you pay a toll he has no legal authority to collect, or he will take your cargo. And here's the cruelty of it. What do? You pay because you're on the river weeks away from home with no one to appeal to carrying goods that are worth more than most people in this story would earn in a year. You pay, and then you move on to the next chain. By 1254, the merchants and cities of the Rhine had simply had enough. That year, an alliance called the Rhine League was formed. It brought together more than 100 cities along with several princes and powerful church lords who had all decided that the robritta problem had become an existential threat to their economies. The Rhine League's approach to the problem of robber knights was efficient. And I'll be honest, It's not satisfying to read about. They besieged the robber castles. They captured and destroyed them. In the 3 years after the League was founded, for major rail Britta were targeted, and somewhere between 10 and 12 of their castles were besieged, destroyed, or rendered unusable. The Great Interregnum eventually ended in 1273 when Rudolf of Habsburg became emperor, and Rudolf, having watched the Ren League strategy work, applied it systematically. He identified the remaining highway robbers. He took their castles. He hanged them, which is historically speaking a fairly unambiguous statement of policy. Now, I want to step back from the drama for a moment, because there's a subtler point here that I think is easy to miss. The toll system, even when it wasn't being actively abused by robber knights, was already doing significant damage to trade by its sheer existence and complexity. Think about what a merchant faced on a journey from, say, a town in northern Germany to the trade fairs of Champagne. Every significant road led through multiple lordships. Each lordship had its own toll rates. Each toll station had its own rules about what goods were being counted, in what quantities, by what measures. One station might charge by the sack, another by the weight, another by the number of animals in your party. There was no standardization. There was no universal exchange rate. There were multiple currencies in circulation. And a merchant crossing from one territory to the next might need to pay in a completely different coin. One legitimate French toll list from the 13th century, the Pont of Ainong records I mentioned earlier, was already itemizing separate rates for horses, wagons, donkeys, cows, and sheep. Multiply that complexity across 50 different toll stations on a single journey, each with its own slightly different pricing logic, its own guards, its own tolerance or intolerance for merchants who try to negotiate. And then factor in this. There are also tolls called mirage to fund the maintenance of town walls, tolls called pavage to fund the paving of streets, tolls called pontage specifically for bridge maintenance, tolls called chiage for docking at a river wharf. All legitimate, all separate, all payable. Has anyone else ever felt this way at the airport? Check bag fee, carry-on fee, seat, selection fee, priority, boarding, food, water. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. The structural logic of medieval tolls and the structural logic of modern airline fees are more similar than any of us would probably like to admit. You have something people need. You control access to it, and you find every possible granular category through which to extract payment. The medieval lord did not invent this idea. He just had a castle instead of a website. The toll system shaped medieval trade in ways that are easy to underestimate because it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an economic filter. The tolls were high enough that, as the historical record consistently confirms, only luxury goods were worth transporting long distances by land. The math simply didn't work for anything else. A cartload of grain, already not a high-value product, would be nearly worthless by the time you paid enough tolls to move it from one region to another. A bag of pepper from the Far East worth roughly its weight in silver could absorb the toll costs and still leave a profit. This single fact that the toll system made only luxury goods viable for long-distance land trade shaped what medieval Europe ate, what it wore, what it used in medicine, what it could afford to want. The toll gates didn't just cost merchants money. They filtered the entire material culture of a civilization, and merchants being the people they were adapted. They found routes that avoided the worst toll concentrations. They formed caravans to share costs. They bribed toll collectors. There's abundant historical evidence of this documented with a wonderful medieval euphemism of gifts to toll officials. Powerful merchants obtained letters of safe conduct from kings and princes. These were formal documents, actual written guarantees that promised a specific merchant or merchant group free passage through a territory without being stopped for tolls. These letters were worth their weight in gold, and the ability to obtain one was itself a reflection of how much social and economic power a merchant had accumulated. The small peddler walked through the gates and paid. The wealthy merchant had a letter, and somewhere between these two positions lay the entire arc of a career in medieval trade. What strikes me most about the toll system, when I really sit with it, is not its cruelty, it's its accidental honesty. Because in a world without income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, In a world where the entire concept of a modern revenue system simply didn't exist, the toll was how power expressed itself economically. You controlled land. You controlled the passage of people and goods across that land. You charged for that passage. It was raw. It was local. It was often abusive. But it was also in its own way a transparent expression of who had power and who had to pay for the privilege of moving through a world that someone else claimed to own. And in that sense, traveling through medieval Europe as a merchant was not just a physical experience. It was a constant daily education in the geography of power. Every toll gate told you exactly who was in charge of this particular stretch of earth, and what they thought your journey through it was worth. Speaking of journeys and the people who controlled them, we've talked so far about the open road, the physical conditions, the merchants, and the system of payments that shaped every step. But we haven't yet talked about what happened when the road ended for the day. When the light failed and the body said enough. When a merchant, a pilgrim, a traveling monk, or a minor official on royal business needed somewhere to stop, to eat, to sleep, to hear another human voice after hours of solitary walking. The medieval inn was one of the most fascinating institutions of the entire trade world, and it was nothing, absolutely nothing like you're imagining. Let's step inside one now. Step inside with me for a moment. Not literally. Of course, you're probably lying somewhere warm and comfortable right now, which is honestly exactly where you should be. But close your eyes for just a breath and imagine the end of a long day on the medieval trade road. Your feet ache, your back aches. You've paid 3 tolls, navigated a stretch of road that was barely navigable, and you've been walking since before the sun rose. Ahead of you, at the edge of a town, there is a building, light leaking from its shuttered windows, the smell of smoke and roasting meat drifting out into the cold evening air, the sound muffled but unmistakable of voices, multiple voices, human warmth. You push open the door and you step into one of the most fascinating microworlds of the entire medieval road system, the inn. Now, I've told you before that medieval roads were nothing like what most people imagine, and the medieval inn follows exactly the same rule. Whatever you're picturing right now, cozy private rooms, a friendly innkeeper who knows your name, a warm fire all to yourself, let that image go. The reality was considerably more communal and considerably more interesting. Let me start with what a real medieval and actually looked like structurally. Historical records from the later Middle Ages describe inns with a main hall, the heart of the whole operation, where travelers gathered to eat and drink and do whatever else travelers do after a hard day of walking. Long wooden tables, benches, not chairs, a large hearth. Then off the hall, sleeping chambers. These chambers typically held anywhere from 1 to 3 beds each. But here's the part your imagination has probably politely glossed over. Those beds were shared, not shared with your traveling companion necessarily, shared with strangers. Historical accounts describe travelers sleeping 3 and 4 to a bed in common inns packed together in the dark, listening to each other breathe, trying to find enough blanket to stay warm. In the smaller, cheaper establishments, travelers sometimes shared one room, holding up to a dozen beds, all of them full. And some accounts describe travelers sharing rooms and beds with the innkeeper and his family, because that was simply how space worked. There was no concept of privacy in the modern sense. Privacy in the medieval world was a luxury that cost significantly more than most people could afford. Let's talk about what those beds actually felt like, because this detail, I think, is one of the most quietly uncomfortable things about medieval in life. The veterans, the ones catering to merchants, government officials, and wealthier travelers would spread fresh rushes on the floor. The records note that the better-managed establishments sometimes mixed their rushes with rose petals, lavender, or herbs, which sounds lovely, except the rushes were not changed every day. They were added to layer upon layer for weeks at a time. And beneath the fresh top layer, the older layers accumulated everything you might expect to accumulate in a room where people ate, slept, spilled their ale, and brought in boots covered in mud and horse dung from the courtyard. There is a famous line from the Dutch humanist Erasmus, writing in the early 16th century, still within living memory of the medieval inn tradition, where he describes English and floors as resounding with putrefaction, and notes that such flaws were a harbor for rectoration, for the infiltration of ale and fat, for all manner of refuse. I'll spare you any further elaboration. Erasmus had strong feelings, and strong feelings in that era were usually earned. Now, here's where something shifts, though, because in the middle of all this, the communal beds, the dubious floors, the smoke-blackened rafters, something genuinely remarkable was happening. People were talking. More specifically, people who would never under any other circumstances be in the same room together were sitting at the same table, eating the same food, drinking the same ale, and having actual conversations. A wool merchant from England might find himself at a bench beside a German scholar making his way to a university in Italy. A minor knight on royal business might be seated across from a farmer who had come to town to sell his surplus grain. A Flemish cloth trader might listen to a French jeweler, a traveling musician, describe the road conditions 3 days south in exchange for a shared meal. The medieval was at its best something genuinely democratic, not politically, but spatially. It was one of the very few places in medieval society where the walls between social classes became temporarily permeable, where who you sat next was determined by what bench had space, not by rank or birth. And I think that accidental democracy was one of the most quietly radical things about it. Let's talk about the man who made all of this possible, the innkeeper. And I want to start with the most famous innkeeper in all of medieval literature, because he is also historians believe a real person. His name was Harry Bailey. If that name doesn't ring a bell, Harry Bailey is the proprietor of the Taverns in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales written in the 1380s. And here's the detail I find endlessly compelling. The Taverns was real. It stood on Bureau High Street in Suffolk, just south of the Thames in London, precisely at the point where several major road routes merged before crossing into the city. The inn was originally built in 137, not by a merchant, not by a lord, but by the abbot of Hyde, a monastery in Winchester who needed a comfortable place for himself and his ecclesiastical colleagues to stay when they had business in London, which is itself a detail that says a great deal about the medieval world. Even monks needed somewhere good to stop. The Tabard became one of the most famous in England partly because of Chaucer, but it was already well established and well used long before he immortalized it in verse. Suffolk, where it stood, was a fascinating neighborhood. It sat just outside the official jurisdiction of the City of London, which meant that activities prohibited within the city walls certain kinds of entertainment, certain kinds of commerce were technically permitted in Suffolk. The area was known for its variety. Pilgrims heading to Canterbury, merchants heading to the Channel ports, and according to contemporary accounts, everything else that tends to cluster around a place where travelers gather with money in their pockets and a day's journey behind them. Chaucer captured it with his typical precision at the Tabard. On any given night, you might find 29 pilgrims, a knight, a miller, a cook, a pardoner, a wife of Bath, who had married 5 times and was on her way to a 6th attempt. Every social class, every kind of human being, one roof, one shared table, one cheerful, practical innkeeper making sure everybody got fed and nobody murdered anybody before morning. And what do they eat? This is the question that nobody ever seems to ask. And I think it's one of the most grounding details in all of medieval social history, because food, in the end, is what ties all of us to any moment in history. In Paris, a 14th century traveler stopping at a roadside and could expect bread. Always bread the foundation of every meal, along with cheese peas, bacon, tripe herring, and savory pies. In England, the standard and fare was pottage, a thick, hearty stew of whatever vegetables and grains were available, sometimes enriched with bits of meat or fish cooked in a pot over the fire, and ladled into a wooden bowl. Bread, cheese, eggs when available, roasted meat on better evenings, goose chicken, or whatever the kitchen had managed to source locally, and a drink almost certainly not water. This is one of those historical details that never stops feeling strange to modern ears. Medieval people drank ale and beer and diluted wine not because they were all constantly trying to get drunk, but because water in towns and near trade routes was genuinely unreliable. Contaminated water was a consistent and serious health risk. Fermented beverages, ale, small beer-like wine were safer, more predictable. Historical records suggest that in late medieval England, per-person annual consumption of ale and beer was somewhere between 275 and 300 L per person per year. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the equivalent of almost a liter of beer a day every day, including children who drank the weaker small beer at mealtimes. This was not indulgence. This was public health strategy in a world without chlorination. And what did all of this cost? Because cost mattered enormously to the range of people using these inns. Surviving accounts from 14th century England give us some specific figures. A basic bed in a common chamber 1 to 3 pennies per night. A simple evening meal of bread pottage and ale 1 to 4 pennies. Stabling for a horse, which was non-negotiable if you travel by horseback 2 to 6 pennies per horse. For context, an unskilled laborer in this period earned roughly 2 to 4 pennies a day. So, a modest night at a common and bed meal, perhaps a drink, could cost the equivalent of 1 to 3 days' wages for the people at the bottom of the working economy. For a successful merchant, it was manageable. For a poor pilgrim walking to Canterbury, it was a genuine sacrifice, which is precisely why the monasteries along the major pilgrimage routes offered guest houses, often free or for a minimal offering specifically for travelers who couldn't afford commercial accommodation. The medieval road had a tiered hospitality system, and not everyone got the same tier. But the innkeeper, and this is the part one find genuinely underappreciated, was far more than a person who rented beds and sold cottage. Historical research into medieval English inns describes the innkeeper as simultaneously a hotelier, a banker, a warehouse manager, a transport coordinator, and occasionally an intelligence agent. Innkeepers stored merchants' goods in their secure cellars. They organized the onward transport of those goods when the method of travel changed. When cargo arriving by river needed to continue by road, the innkeeper was often the one who arranged the carts and pack animals. Some innkeepers extended credit to trusted merchants. Some acted as informal bankers, safeguarding valuables. Some of the most powerful ones situated along the busiest routes became genuinely wealthy and influential figures in their towns, serving on local councils and participating in the same civic life as merchants and guild members. The best innkeepers were in effect nodes in a network. They knew who was traveling where. They knew which roads were passable and which weren't. They knew which merchants were creditworthy and which weren't. They knew in the way that only someone who sits at the same crossroads for 20 years can know who was doing what and where it was going. And that knowledge was worth in its own quiet way almost as much as the beds they rented. Here is what I find myself thinking about when I consider the medieval inn. We've been conditioned by centuries of literature and cinema and vague cultural memory to think of these places as colorful but rough backdrops, as settings for other people's stories. But to the people who actually lived this, the merchants, the pilgrims, the traveling monks, the government messengers, the wandering musicians, the inn was something much more specific. It was the only reliable point of warmth and human company in a journey that was otherwise solitary, uncomfortable, and genuinely uncertain. After a day of navigating bad roads, paying hostile toll collectors, watching the sky for weather, and calculating how far to push before the light failed, the inn was safety. The inn was food. The inn was the sound of other voices. The inn was in the truest possible sense a place where the road paused for a breath. And I think there is something deeply human about that. Something that hasn't changed even a little bit in 700 years. The need at the end of a hard day, of moving through an uncertain world to find a warm room, to sit down, to eat something, to hear other people talking, to feel just for one night like you've arrived somewhere. But not everyone who came through the inn door was a weary merchant or a footsore pilgrim. Some of the most fascinating figures in this entire story, the people who arguably did the most to keep the whole system of medieval trade roads alive, came to these inns for very different reasons. Or more precisely, they never quite left. The road itself was their life, their danger, their livelihood, their identity. I'm talking about the people who made medieval travel not just difficult, but genuinely perilous. The ones who waited in the shadows outside the warm light of the indoor. The ones who watched the road with a very different kind of attention than a merchant or a pilgrim. And understanding who they were, what drove them, what constrained them, and why the line between danger and order on the medieval road was far more complicated than any fairy tale ever admitted, is where our story goes next. Something has always quietly fascinated me about the way danger worked on a medieval trade road. Because when most people imagine the risks of medieval travel, they picture something out of a fairy tale, a lone highwayman, a figure in a dark cloak stepping out from behind a tree, a dramatic confrontation. But the reality of danger on the medieval road was considerably more unsettling than that, more complicated, more human, and in some ways far, far stranger. Let me start with a legal concept that I think is one of the most illuminating things in all of medieval English law. The concept of the wolf's head. In medieval England, when a person was declared an outlaw formally officially by the courts, they were said to carry a wolf's head. Not metaphorically. The legal phrase was precise. An outlaw bore a wolf's head which may be cut off by anyone with impunity. What this meant in practice was that an outlaw had been expelled entirely from the protection of the law. They had no legal rights, no property. Any contract they had signed was void, and any person at all, could apprehend them, use force against them, or in extreme cases end their life without fear of legal consequence. The outlaw was, in the eyes of the law, no longer quite human. They had been reduced to the status of a wolf, a creature of the wilderness outside the bounds of civilization, dangerous and excluded, which is a remarkable piece of social philosophy dressed up as legal procedure. And it tells you everything about how medieval society thought about the boundary between the road and the forest. The road was civilization. The forest was everything else. But here is what the theory never quite captured, because the people who actually lived on that boundary between the road and the forest were not wolves. They were people with names and families and histories. And sometimes this is the part that is genuinely extraordinary. They were people you would have recognized. People from the gentry, from the minor nobility, from the class of society that was supposed to be maintaining order, not disrupting it. Let me tell you about the Falvilles. John de Falville was a lord of a manor in Leicester, England, a respectable man, a knight of the shire who served in Parliament, a commissioner, a figure of a local authority. He died in 1310, leaving behind 7 sons. The eldest son, John, inherited the manor and lived an unremarkable law-abiding life. The other 6, Eustace Lawrence, Richard Robert Thomas, and Walter, chose a very different path. On the 29th of January, 1326, a man named Roger Bellers, a baron of the Exchequer and owner of 9 manors, was traveling on the road between his manor of Kirby Bellers and the city of Leicester. He was accompanied by a large retinue. He was by all accounts a powerful and well-protected man. It didn't help him. Eustace Falville led a band of 50 men to a valley near Reby and ambushed the entire party. Roger Bellers was killed on the road in broad daylight by a group of men who were technically speaking minor gentlemen of Leicester. The Falvilles promptly fled first to Wales, then to France, and were declared outlaws by the crown. King Edward II himself reportedly named them as inexcusable, stating that even if they surrendered, they would not be pardoned. Now, here's where the story takes the turn that makes it genuinely interesting. The people of Leicester did not buy and large mourn Roger Bellers because Bellers had a reputation. He'd been widely known as an oppressor of his neighbors, both ordinary people and religious houses, in his relentless acquisition of property. And Eustace Falville, though clearly operating outside the law, had killed a man that many people felt the law should have dealt with years earlier. Within a few years, the Falvilles had been pardoned in exchange for fighting for the crown in its wars. Then they went back to crime, then pardoned again, then back to crime. Eustace Falville died peacefully in 1347, never having stood trial for a single charge brought against him, having been Ned for his military service, and ending his days as a counselor. I want to let that land for a moment. A man who committed murder on a public road, led an organized criminal band for over 20 years, kidnapped a royal justice, extorted entire towns, was Ned, and celebrated in the poetry of his own era as a hero who brought justice to those the law failed. Specifically, the famous 14th century poem Piers Plowman, written by William Langland around 1377, mentions the Fallvilles by name as men who use their own brand of law to fix it for false men. The same poem contains the first known literary reference to Robin Hood. That is not a coincidence. The line between the outlaw hero and the criminal was drawn by who you were and who your victims were. If you robbed merchants and common people, you were a bandit. If you killed a corrupt baron and kidnapped a crooked judge, well, that was a different conversation. And the kidnapping of a judge, let me tell you about that one, because it is one of the most audacious things I have ever encountered in medieval history. In January of 1332, a royal justice named Richard de Willoughby was traveling through the East Midlands on a judicial commission. He was by most accounts not beloved. He had repeatedly clashed with local gangs in his capacity as a judge. The Fallvilles allied with another notorious band called the Cotarl Gang, who operated out of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, including Sherwood Forest, and were led by a man named James Cotarel, who described himself in threatening letters as Lionel King of the Rout of Raveners, riding from our Castle of the Wind in the Greenwood Tower. These combined gangs, somewhere between 20 and 30 armed men, captured Willoughby on the road from Melton to Grantham. They smuggled him through the woods, moving from one forest to the next to stay ahead of any pursuit, and they held him for ransom. The amount they demanded was 1,300 marks, which Willoughby, who was evidently a wealthy man, raised by the following day. One day, 1,300 marks paid to get out of the woods alive. The Fallvilles received 300 marks of that ransom, which they proceeded to spend in part on further criminal activities. Now, what does this tell us about the actual danger of the medieval trade road? It tells us something that is, I think, more important than just the drama of specific crimes. It tells us that danger on the road did not come only from desperate men with nothing to lose. It came from organized groups, from people with local knowledge, from people who understood the rhythms of travel, who knew which roads the wealthy merchants used, and when and how many in their party. The medieval forest was not just a romantic setting. It was a genuine operational base, a place beyond the effective reach of royal authority, where men with horses, weapons, and networks of informants and safe houses could operate for years. The cultural gang had a specific strategy. They never stayed more than a month in the same location. They had spies watching for the sheriff's men. They cooperated with other gangs on ambitious operations. They had embedded within their network members who also held legitimate offices, bailiffs, constables of castles, even men who served in Parliament. The line between law enforcement and organized crime on the medieval road was genuinely porous, and a merchant traveling with a loaded cart of valuable goods moving through the East Midlands in the 1330s would have been moving through territory where the Fallvilles and the Cotarels were effectively a parallel authority, one you could not appeal to the sheriff about, because the sheriff might have been working with them. So what did ordinary travelers actually do about all of this? This is the practical question that fascinates me most, and the answer reveals something very intelligent about the traveling people of this era. First, travel in groups whenever possible. This is consistent across every category of medieval traveler: merchants, pilgrims, students, government messengers. A lone man on an empty road was a target. A party of 30 people, some of them armed, was a different proposition entirely. The Canterbury Tales famously begins with 29 pilgrims finding each other at the Tabardin and deciding to travel together to Canterbury. Chaucer presents this as a happy coincidence of fellowship. It was also on a very practical level a sensible safety strategy. Second, avoid traveling after dark. Every medieval travel guide, every set of practical instructions for merchants and pilgrims emphasizes the same point: be within the walls of a town or a monastery before nightfall. The road after dark was a different world, one where neither the informal social order of daylight travel nor the limited legal protections of town life applied. Third, the King's Highway itself offered a specific legal protection. In England, major roads were designated as King's Highways, the Raycrassen of England, and violence committed on them was technically a far more serious offense than violence committed elsewhere. The law required that the sides of major roads be cleared of undergrowth and trees for a distance of 200 feet on either side to deny outlaws places of concealment. 200 feet of cleared land on each side of the road. This is documented. This was actual policy. Was it always enforced? Absolutely not. But the existence of the rule tells you something important about how seriously the Crown understood the problem. And there is one more dimension to the danger of the medieval road that rarely gets discussed. And I think it might be the most psychologically interesting one. It wasn't just organized criminals you had to worry about. It was the corruption of legitimate authority. We saw it with the Roberter of the Ree lords with the legal right to collect tolls who used that right to strangle trade. We see it again with figures like Roger Bellers, the very man the Falvilles killed a baron of the Exchequer, who used his legal power to oppress his neighbors until someone decided they had had enough. And it appears over and over in medieval travel accounts. The corrupt sheriff who extorted travelers instead of protecting them. The dishonest innkeeper who misdirected wealthy travelers to dangerous establishments. The toll collector who charged 3 times the legal rate because there was no one with authority watching him. A document from the reign of Henry III, mid-13th century, describes the situation in parts of the English Midlands in stark terms. Through outlaws, robbers, thieves, and malefactors mounted or on foot, wandering by day and by night in the counties of Nottingham, Leicester, and Derby. So many and great homicides were done that no one with a small company could pass through most parts without being taken and killed or spoiled as goods. Read that again. No one with a small company could pass through most parts. This is not a fairy tale. This is a government document, a description of actual conditions on actual roads in the heart of England in the 13th century. What strikes me sitting with all of this is how clearly it illustrates the central tension that ran through every aspect of life on the medieval trade road. It was a world where civilization and its absence existed in very close proximity, where the warmth of the inn and the darkness of the forest were sometimes only a few hundred yards apart, where the same person might be on different days a legitimate toll collector and an extortionist, a minor lord and a gang leader, a royal justice and a man hiding in the woods from the law. The medieval road was not a safe place. It was a negotiation, a daily ongoing negotiation between the need to move and the forces natural human institutional that made movement dangerous. And the people who lived that negotiation every day, the merchants, the pilgrims, the travelers, developed a kind of pragmatic courage that I find genuinely admirable. They went anyway. They calculated the risk. They chose the larger group when they could. They stayed inside the walls at night. They carried their letters of safe conduct. They kept their most valuable goods hidden. And in the morning, they stepped back onto the road. Because the world on the other side of the journey was worth the world in between. We've been walking this road for a while now, and we've met a remarkable range of people. Merchants and innkeepers, toll collectors and outlaws, lords who built their wealth on a chain across a river, brothers who became legends by refusing to accept that the law and justice were the same thing. But there is a category of traveler we haven't spent nearly enough time with yet. One of the most important figures on the medieval trade road. Someone whose journey was different from all the others we've discussed. Not primarily motivated by commerce or crime or official duty, but by something more intimate, more complicated, more human than any of those things. The pilgrim in the world of medieval pilgrimage. What it actually meant to put on your traveling cloak, pick up your staff, and set out walking toward a place you believed was sacred is a story so layered, so surprising, and so full of quietly extraordinary people that it deserves its own chapter entirely. Let's go there. Now, of all the figures who walked the medieval trade roads, there is one category of traveler that has always struck me as the most quietly extraordinary. Not the merchants calculating profit margins at every toll gate. Not the outlaws hiding in the greenwood. Not even the kings and ambassadors with their entourages and their letters of safe conduct. The pilgrims, the people who packed a staff and a small purse and left everything familiar behind. Not because they had to, not primarily because of commerce or law or official duty, but because something inside them said that they needed to go somewhere, that there was a place in the world where something sacred had happened, And that getting there on foot through all the weather and mud and risk and discomfort we've spent the last several hours talking about was itself the point. Here's a detail that I think reframes everything we know about medieval pilgrimage. At its peak, and we're talking primarily the 12th and 13th centuries, the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral was receiving an estimated 200,000 pilgrims a year, 200,000 people in one English city every year. The shrine itself, for those who have never encountered a description of it, was a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses. It was decorated with gold plate, studded with precious jewels, featuring at its center a particularly enormous ruby, a gift from the King of France, Louis VI, who came there in 1179, seeking a miracle cure for his own son. Louis VI placed a gold coin on the altar that day, and as an ongoing gift, he granted the priory an annual income of 1,600 gallons of wine for a single visit to a single shrine in one city. That is the scale of what pilgrimage meant to medieval Europe. But 200,000 visitors a year tells you the numbers. It doesn't tell you the people. And the people are where it gets interesting. Who actually went on pilgrimage? The honest answer is everyone. Pilgrimage in medieval Europe was not reserved for the especially devout or the especially wealthy or any particular social class. It was used by kings seeking cures for sick children, by farmers seeking God's help with a failing harvest, by merchants making a business trip who tacked a shrine visit onto the itinerary, by criminals assigned pilgrimage as a legal punishment. Yes, this was a real thing. Medieval English bishops used pilgrimage as a sentence for a variety of offenses: poaching on church estates, slandering your neighbor. One Archbishop of Canterbury in 1283 ordered a clerk who'd been found guilty of sleeping with his godmother to make pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and Cologne in 3 successive years. 3 years, 3 major pilgrimages for one transgression. That was by any measure a significant sentence. And it tells you that pilgrimage wasn't only about spiritual reward. It was also in its own way about suffering, about the road itself as punishment, as ordeal, as proof that you had taken your wrongdoing seriously enough to endure what the road required. What did a pilgrim actually look like walking those roads? There was a recognizable costume, at least in the early and high medieval period. A long, coarse outer garment practical for weather easy to walk in. A broad-brimmed hat to keep the rain off. A staff for walking and for self-defense. A small purse, the script worn at the belt, carrying whatever coins, documents, and small necessities the pilgrim could afford. And the badges. This is the detail I find most charming. As you completed each major pilgrimage destination, you would acquire a badge from Canterbury. A small pewter image of Thomas Becket or a container of holy water mixed with, as the shrines claimed, a tiny drop of the saint's blood. From Santiago de Compostela in Spain, a scallop shell, still the universal symbol of the Camino today. From Rome, cross keys representing St. Peter. These badges were worn on the hat and cloak, and a serious pilgrim, someone who had done the circuit of multiple major shrines, would be walking around covered in the physical evidence of their journeys. A kind of medieval passport, a visible record of everywhere you had been and every act of devotion you had performed. Now, let me tell you about a woman who I believe is one of the most fascinating people to have ever walked the medieval road. Her name was Marjorie Kemper. She was born around 1373 in King's Lynn, Norfolk, England. Her father was a merchant, a mayor of the town, and a member of Parliament 6 times over. She married at 20. She had 14 children, 14. She ran a brewery, which failed. She ran a grain mill, which also failed. And then in her early 40s, having been married for 20 years, having raised 14 children through medieval childhood mortality rates, having failed at 2 businesses, Marjorie Kemp negotiated a deal with her husband. The deal was this. She would pay his debts. He would agree to a celibate marriage, and she would be free to go on pilgrimage. In 1414, Marjorie Kemp set out for Jerusalem. Now, I want to pause here and ask you something, because I find this question genuinely interesting. Why would a woman in medieval England, a middle-aged mother of 14, in an era when women had almost no independent legal existence, in a world we've spent the last several hours establishing, was physically difficult, dangerous, and expensive. Choose to walk across half of Europe and sail to the Holy Land. The obvious answer is faith, and faith was genuinely part of it. But here's what I think the more complete answer is. Pilgrimage in medieval society was one of the only legitimate reasons a person, particularly a woman, particularly a married woman, could leave her home and move through the world with relative social freedom. It was the one context in which the road was not just permitted but praised, in which being far from home was not a failure of domestic duty, but an act of spiritual courage. The Pilgrim Road was for a woman like Marjorie Kemp something genuinely close to liberation. Her journey was by all accounts not a serene spiritual experience. Marjorie had a habit, while in the presence of sacred sites, of bursting into extremely loud, sustained weeping. Not delicate, refined weeping, sustained physical full-body weeping. She herself described it as crying until she was blue. She received what she called the gift of tears at the Mount of Calvary in Jerusalem. And from that point forward, the tears arrived regularly and voluntarily at the most inconvenient possible moments. This was, to put it gently, not popular with her traveling companions. On the voyage out from Venice, and pilgrims typically spent 3 months in Venice waiting for the galleys that took them to the Holy Land. Her fellow pilgrims asked not to eat with her, so Marjorie ate alone for 6 weeks. On the road, they threatened to abandon her. They cut the skirt of her gown, a practical act of spite designed to embarrass her and mark her as different. They stole her money. They confiscated the bedding she needed for the sea crossing. And yet she completed the pilgrimage. She went to Jerusalem. She saw the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. She went to Bethlehem. She traveled to Rome. She visited Santiago de Compostela. She made pilgrimages to Germany, to Poland, to Norway. She traveled in total more miles in her lifetime than most people of her era and social class could have dreamed of. And when she was done, older now, back in England, she dictated her experiences to a scribe, because she couldn't write herself, but she had a story, and she was not going to leave it untold. The result, the Book of Marjorie Kemp, is considered by many scholars to be the first autobiography in the English language written by an illiterate woman in her own words about her own life on the medieval road. And now I want to take a step back from Marjorie's individual story to say something about pilgrimage more broadly, because I think this is where the intersection with the trade road becomes genuinely illuminating. The pilgrim and the merchant traveled the same roads, often literally the same roads at the same times. They stayed in the same inns. They paid the same tolls. They faced the same weather and the same outlaws. But their relationship to the road was fundamentally different. The merchant was on a road to make money. The pilgrim was on the road to make meaning. And here's the thing that often gets missed. Those two purposes were not always separate. It was entirely common, historically documented, not just suspected, for merchants to combine commercial journeys with shrine visits, to route a trading trip through a town where a pilgrimage could be made, to carry goods to the fairs of Champagne on the way back from Rome, to collect orders from clients while visiting Canterbury. The medieval road did not recognize the modern distinction between the sacred and the commercial. On the same cart, in the same saddlebag, a merchant might carry a bolt of valuable cloth and a pilgrim's badge from the last shrine he had visited. The spiritual and the economic traveled together, fed from the same pot of pottage at the same inn, slept in the same bed. But perhaps the most profound thing that pilgrimage added to the trade road world, more than the economic activity it generated, more than the infrastructure it created, more than any specific individual like Marjorie Kemp, was the idea of the journey itself as meaningful, that the road was not just a problem to be solved, not just a series of obstacles to navigate, but a transformation. Medieval theology was explicit about this. The pilgrimage route was supposed to change you. The hardships of the road were not accidents or misfortunes. They were the point. They were the suffering that made the arrival sacred. They were the proof that you had wanted it badly enough to endure what the road required. And I find that idea old, as it is embedded in a religious tradition far removed from most of our daily lives. I find it strangely moving because the road transformation is not a medieval idea. It is a human one, something in us recognizes across all the centuries between Marjorie Kemp's muddy boots and our own comfortable shoes that there is a kind of arriving that can only be achieved by actually going, by putting your body on the road, by accepting that the journey is part of the destination. We've walked a long way tonight. We've met merchants, innkeepers, toll collectors, outlaws, and pilgrims. We've felt the mud under our feet and the weight of a laden cart. We've heard the chains across the Rhine and the weeping of a woman in white at the walls of Jerusalem. And all of it, every story, every road, every difficult mile was embedded in a world of villages and towns that grew and changed, and sometimes died entirely based on their relationship to one thing. Whether the road ran through them, whether the traders and the pilgrims and the merchants stopped at their gates or passed by on the other side, the story of those villages, the ones that thrived on the road, and the ones that tried and failed to hold it, is one of the most dramatic and least told stories in all of medieval history. And it's exactly where we're going next. There's a town about 95 kilometers southeast of Paris that I keep thinking about. Its name is Provence. Today, it has fewer than 12,000 inhabitants. Quiet streets, rapeseed fields glowing yellow in the distance, a population smaller than many American suburbs. And yet, if you walk through its upper town, you'll find yourself surrounded by buildings from the 12th century. Intact city walls with 2 gates and 22 towers still standing exactly as they were placed 800 years ago. An enormous collegiate church whose construction was begun in the 12th century and never completed because the money ran out. And beneath the streets, a network of vaulted stone cellars, 150 of them still accessible today, built specifically to store the goods of merchants who came from every corner of the known world. Provence is a time capsule, a town that was once one of the most commercially important places in all of Europe. And then when the road moved on, it stopped. Just stopped. And has been preserved in that moment ever since. Here's the thing about medieval villages and towns that I don't think gets discussed nearly enough. Their existence was never guaranteed. A modern city has layers of institutional inertia working in its favor. Government offices, universities, established infrastructure, transportation networks built and rebuilt over centuries. A medieval town had one thing, the road, or more specifically, the relationship between the town and the people who needed to pass through it. If that relationship worked, if the town was positioned at the right crossroads, offered the right services, was protected by the right authority, it could grow from a market village into a commercial center within a generation. If that relationship broke down, if the road shifted, if the political protection vanished, if a rival town offered better terms to the merchants, the same town could empty out just as fast. The medieval road did not play favorites. It rewarded utility and punished complacency with equal efficiency. Provence is the clearest example I know of both sides of that equation. In the early 12th century, the Counts of Champagne made a decision. They would turn the towns of their territory, Provence-Trou-Li-Baser, into the commercial heart of Europe. They would hold trade fairs, not casual market days, real fairs weeks long, internationally attended, backed by the full legal and military power of the Count's authority. And to make merchants feel safe enough to come, they did something genuinely sophisticated for the era. They created a dedicated police force called the Guards of the Fair, whose entire function was to protect merchants and enforce contracts during the fair period. They strictly regulated weights and measures so that a cloth merchant from Flanders and a spice trader from Venice could both trust that the scales and measuring rods were honest. They established fair courts tribunals specifically designed to resolve commercial disputes quickly and impartially, whose reputation for efficiency attracted merchants who needed to know that their agreements would be honored. And they extended these protections beyond the fair itself, guaranteeing safe conduct to merchants traveling to and from Champagne. As one historian later summarized it, the success of the Champagne fairs was attributable solely to the intelligent application of public order to business. In other words, trust, institutionalized and forced, reliable trust. That was the product the Counts were selling, and merchants came from everywhere to buy it. At the height of the Champagne fairs, roughly from about 1180 to about 1300, Provence was the third largest city in the entire region. Think about that. A town that today has fewer than 12,000 people was in the 13th century a major city. It hosted 2 fairs a year, each lasting several weeks. The schedule was precise and formalized. The first week, merchants arrived and set up stalls along the streets of the town. The next 10 days, the cloth fair. The following 11 days, leather and fur. The next 19 days, spices and other goods sold by weight. The final few days, accounts were settled. Debts were resolved not in coin, which would require merchants to carry dangerously large sums across hundreds of miles of road, but through written instruments. Bills of exchange. A merchant could arrive at Provence from Florence with a letter of credit, do business for 6 weeks, settle his accounts through the fair court's notarial system, and leave without having carried a single heavy coin through the Alpine passes. In the vaulted stone cellars beneath the streets, some of which you can walk through today, merchants stored their goods between fair sessions. Wool from Scandinavia, linen from the Low Countries, cloth from Flanders, leather from Spain, silk from the east carried overland from the Mediterranean ports. All of it passing through Provence. All of it catalogued, weighed, contracted, and moved. All of it because the Counts of Champagne had understood something fundamental. A town on a trade road doesn't need to produce anything. It just needs to make it safe and easy for others to do business there. Now, here's where the story turns. Because Provence didn't decline because of a war or a plague, at least not initially. It declined because of a wedding. In 1284, the heirs of the County of Champagne married the future king, Philip IV of France. It was a politically advantageous match. And when the region was formally absorbed into the Kingdom of France in 1285, the special political status that had made the fairs possible, the independent authority of the counts, their ability to grant and enforce merchant privileges outside the normal hierarchy of French law ceased to exist. The fairs didn't end immediately, but the special motivation, the independent guarantee that no other authority in France could offer was gone. King Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, which feels like a name designed to irritate historians, visited Provence several times and levied devastating taxes that the merchants had no protection against. By 1320, the fairs had declined to a shadow of what they had been. Trade routes shifted southward and westward. The fairs of Geneva and Lyon rose to prominence. The Hanseatic cities of Bruges and Cologne absorbed much of the northern trade in Provence. This city that had been built entirely around the business of commerce, whose streets and cellars and warehouses had been designed specifically to accommodate the merchants of Europe, found itself with nothing but beautiful buildings and empty rooms. It returned to farming. It grew roses. The church, whose construction the fair money was funding, never finished. The Capella sits incomplete to this day, still missing the top that the medieval builders ran out of money to place on it. It stands there in Provence, not as a ruin, but as a statement, a monument to the moment the road moved on. Now, I want you to hold Provence in your mind as I tell you about the other side of this story, because not every town that gained from the road suffered when it shifted. Some towns understood earlier and more clearly than others that the relationship with the road was never permanent, that you had to keep earning it. And the most extraordinary example of a town that did exactly that positioned itself so cleverly, so carefully at the intersection of so many trade interests, is one you've probably heard of. Its name was Bruges. In the late 13th and 14th centuries, as the Champagne fairs declined, the commercial energy of Northern Europe didn't disappear. It migrated. Specifically, it migrated to a city in what is now Belgium, at the edge of the North Sea, where a channel connected the city to the sea, and the sea connected to everywhere. Bruges had something Provence didn't: water access. Italian merchant galleys, the kind that needed 200 oarsmen to move, could sail directly into Bruges from the Mediterranean. German merchants from the Hanseatic League could send their ships down from the Baltic. English wool could arrive by channel crossing, all of them converging on one city, and Bruges, learning from what the Counts of Champagne had built in a previous generation, offered its own guarantees. Abzer I I in northern Europe established in Bruges in around 1300, operating from the house of the Vandert family, whose name gave us the word bourse, and ultimately the word bursa, and the concept of the stock exchange itself, a permanent year-round place where merchants could do business. not dependent on a 6-week fair cycle, not dependent on seasonal roads, open when you needed it, closed only by the limits of commerce itself. Does it strike you how much the medieval trade town was essentially solving a problem that we're still solving today? The problem of trust at a distance. How do you get a merchant in Florence to trust a merchant in Flanders when they've never met, will never meet in person, and need to do a transaction worth several years of ordinary wages? You build an institution. You create a fair court to bourse a reputation system, a set of rules that everyone agrees to follow because everyone knows everyone else will be held to them. This is still at its core what stock exchanges do, what central banks do, what international trade agreements do. The Counts of Champagne didn't invent the concept, but they built one of its earliest and most successful working examples. And when their political protection was withdrawn, the whole structure, beautiful, sophisticated, irreplaceable as it was, simply collapsed, because the institution was stronger than the road itself, but weaker than the political will that sustained it. There's a lesson in that, I think, about how fragile the systems we build for prosperity actually are, how much they depend not just on the genius of their design, but on the continued willingness of the people in power to protect them. Provence had the geography, it had the infrastructure, it had the merchants. What lost was the Count, and without the Count, none of the rest of it was enough. But something else was traveling those roads all along that we haven't fully accounted for yet. Something that didn't need a boss or a fair court or a letter of safe conduct. Something that moved through the medieval road system as silently and efficiently as any piece of cargo. Something that the merchants carried without knowing it, that the pilgrims brought home with them, that the innkeepers absorbed from every guest who passed through their doors. I'm talking about the women, not as symbols, not as passengers, but as the indispensable, systematically overlooked workers who kept the entire road economy running from the inside. The ale wives who brewed the ale, the market women who turned the profit, the wives who ran the business when their husbands were 6 weeks away on the road. Their story is one I find myself thinking about more and more, and it deserves to be told properly. Let's go there next. Let me tell you something that took medieval historians embarrassingly long to acknowledge. The entire trade road economy, the merchants, the inns, the markets, the fairs, the supply chains that connected one end of Europe to the other was running on a foundation that the historical record barely bothered to write down. Because the people who built that foundation were women. Not as a side note, not as occasional exceptions, as the essential, pervasive, systematically undervalued workforce that kept the whole machinery turning every single day while the history books were busy writing about the men. I've been wanting to get to this part of the story for a while. So, let's do it properly. Start with the most basic economic unit on the medieval trade road, the family business. Almost every merchant operation in medieval Europe, from the small-town craftsman to the successful cloth trader operating between two countries, was run as a family enterprise. There was no clean separation between the home and the workshop, between the kitchen and the counting house, between the wife's domain and the husband's domain. That separation is a modern invention and a relatively recent one. In medieval Europe, husband and wife were economic partners in the most fundamental sense. When a wool merchant from London traveled to the Champagne fairs for 6 weeks, and we've talked about what those 6 weeks looked like, his wife did not simply wait at home. She ran the business. She managed the accounts. She supervised the apprentices. She dealt with suppliers, customers, and creditors. She made decisions that affected the family's income and reputation. In fact, a 13th century English legal ordinance, the Ordinance of Founders from 1390, stipulated something remarkable. Each guild master could have only one apprentice, unless he had a wife, in which case he could have two. A wife's contribution was deemed officially to be worth an entire additional apprentice. That tells you what medieval law thought a merchant's wife was actually doing. But let's go deeper than the household level, because I want to tell you about the alews. The brewing of ale in medieval England was for most of the 13th century primarily the work of women, not as a marginal occupation, not as a side income, as the dominant commercial force in one of the most essential industries of the entire medieval economy. Remember what we discussed about water quality, about how people drank ale because the water was unreliable. That ale had to be made constantly by someone, and for most of the medieval period, that someone was a woman working out of her kitchen. The process grew naturally from domestic brewing the ale that a family made to feed itself, and expanded when there was surplus into commercial sale. An aloof wife would put out a signal, typically a pole with a bush or a bundle of straw tied to the end hung above the door, to indicate that fresh ale was available and people came. Because the ale went sour within days of being brewed, production had to be constant and local, which meant that alewives were not centralized figures. They were distributed throughout every village and town, providing a vital service at the neighborhood level. The daily drink of the medieval working world, roughly a gallon per person per day, across all classes, including children drinking the weaker small beer, was produced by women at home for profit at a scale that the historical record has consistently underestimated. Now, here's the detail I find genuinely striking about the alewives. They had enemies, not personal enemies, institutional enemies. Church murals in medieval England sometimes depicted alewives, specifically women, who brewed and sold ale as figures who belonged in hell. Literally painted in a doom, paintings on church walls being hauled down by demons. Their measuring jugs and barrels held up as evidence of their sins. The specific charge watering down the ale, using false measures, cheating customers. And here's the irony that historians have noted. Surviving records from a 1324 inventory of brewing offenses in Oxford show that violations by women and men were roughly equal in number. Men cheated just as often. Women were depicted in hell. The selective demonization of alewives tells you something important about what happens when women are economically successful in a society that hasn't quite decided how to feel about that. You don't celebrate it. You find a narrative that makes a problem. And yet the alewives persisted. Brewster is the historical term for a female brewer in the same way that spinster meant a woman who spins. And for generations, the brewers and alewives of medieval England were indispensable until gradually they were pushed out. After the Black Death of 1347 to 1350, the brewing industry changed. As urbanization increased and standards of living rose, brewing became more capitalized, more professionalized, more profitable. And when a trade becomes reliably profitable, something predictable happens. Men enter it, take it over. The guild structures tighten. The female practitioners are squeezed to the margins. By the 15th and 16th centuries, brewing in England had transitioned from a female-dominated household industry to a male-dominated commercial one. The alewives didn't fail. They were simply successful enough to attract competition that had more legal and institutional protection than they did. But the alewives were only one part of the picture. Let me tell you about the women in the weekly markets, because this is where the daily economic life of the medieval trade road was most visible, and where women were most consistently present in towns along every major trade route. The weekly market was the heartbeat of local commerce, and the stalls selling eggs, dairy products, poultry, and ale. The stalls that provided the everyday essentials that the traveling merchant needed, that the pilgrims bought on their way through, that the innkeeper restocked from every market day, were operated predominantly by women. These were not small operations. These women paid stall fees to local authorities. They competed with each other for position and reputation. They maintained customer relationships over years and decades. Some of them were widows supporting entire households on market income. Some were wives supplementing the family income. Some were independent traders who had found in the market one of the few spaces where a woman's economic activity was not just tolerated, but structurally necessary. A 1363 London City Ordinance specified something quietly remarkable. Men had to keep one trade. Women might pursue as many as they pleased. On the surface, this sounds like an unusual degree of freedom, but read it again. Women could pursue multiple trades because none of the trades they worked were valuable enough individually to be worth protecting from female competition. The ordinance was not a grant of freedom. It was a record of economic marginalization dressed up to look like generosity, and medieval women operated within it anyway. They stacked trades. They combined market selling with brewing, with spinning, with domestic service. They built economic lives from the interstices of a system that wasn't designed to support them. Here's a specific detail from the 100 Rolls of 1274, a royal survey of English landholding and commerce that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. The survey noted that some of the greatest wool merchants in London were widows. Not the greatest female wool merchants, the greatest wool merchants, period. Among them figures like Alice de Montfort and Rose de Burford, whose names appear in records of large-scale wool trading during this period. These were women directing significant commercial operations, handling export transactions that connected English producers to the cloth manufacturers of Flanders, operating in the international trade ecosystem we've spent so many hours exploring tonight. And they were doing it as widows because widowhood was paradoxically one of the clearest paths to economic autonomy in medieval society. Under a concept called cover, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't sign contracts. She couldn't own property independently. She couldn't sue or be sued in her own name. But a widow could. English common law gave widows a law of thirds. A third of the husband's estate to the widow, a third to the children, a third to the church. And with that third, the competent widow could build something. There was also in London and a handful of other major trading cities a legal status called femme sole, roughly woman alone. A woman registered as a femme sole with the mayor of London had the right to trade independently of her husband, to own property, to sign contracts, to sue and be sued in her own name. If her business failed, she bore the consequences alone. If it succeeded, the profits were hers. The first recorded instance of this status in London appears in a legal document from the 1330s. A remarkable thing, a married woman operating as a fully independent legal and commercial entity in the same city at the same time as the champagne fairs were declining and Bruges was becoming the new commercial center of Europe. These women were not anomalies. They were part of the same world. What I keep coming back to sitting with all of this is the gap. The gap between what these women were actually doing, brewing, managing trading, running estates, directing wool exports, maintaining supply chains, and what the historical record chose to document. The problem with women in medieval commerce is not that they were absent. It's that the record keepers, mostly male, mostly operating within a legal system that defined women by their marital status rather than their occupation, saw their contributions as natural, normal, unremarkable, as things that didn't need to be written down because they were simply how things worked. The merchant's wife managed the accounts while he was away. Of course, she did. The alewife brewed the ale the whole village drank. That's just how it was. The widow at the market stall kept the local food supply running. That wasn't commerce. That was women. The distinction, when examined closely, dissolves completely. It was all commerce. It was all essential. It just didn't get written down in the ledger under a woman's name. And there's one more thing I want to say about the women of the medieval trade road before we move on. Because we've talked a great deal in this journey of ours tonight about the things that traveled the road. Wool, spice, cloth, letter of credit ideas. But one of the things that traveled most efficiently, most silently, most persistently along those roads was something intangible. Language, knowledge, cultural practice. And the women who sat at the nodes of that network. The alewife whose establishment was a gathering place. The market woman who had a conversation with every traveler who bought something from her. The innkeeper's wife who heard stories from every corner of Europe over the course of a single week. These women were in a very real sense the oral. Historians of the trade road, the collectors and redistributors of everything that passed through. That role doesn't appear in the wool customs accounts. You won't find it in the fair court records. But take it away, and the whole texture of medieval commercial life, the knowledge that flowed alongside the goods, the social fabric that held the system together falls apart. These women were the road. They just weren't in the history books until now. And speaking of things traveling along the road that we haven't fully accounted for yet, we've talked about goods, money, pilgrims, criminals, women, culture, language. But there is one thing that traveled the medieval trade road with perfect, terrible efficiency. Something no merchant invited. Something no pilgrim sought. Something that used the same networks, the same inns, the same caravans, The same human connections we spent all night exploring and changed everything in 1 year. 1347. That story about what happens when a road becomes a path for something catastrophic is where we're going next. There is a name that appears in the records from the autumn of 1347 that I want you to hold in your mind as we begin this part of the story. The name is Kaffa. It was a port city on the Crimean Peninsula on the northern shore of the Black Sea, a Genoese trading post, one of the most important in the entire eastern Mediterranean trade network. The kind of place where the goods coming west from the Silk Road transferred onto European ships, where spices from the east and furs from the Russian steppes and silk from Central Asia changed hands. A crossroads city alive with commerce. And in the summer of 1347, it was under siege. The Mongol forces of Khanjani Beg had surrounded the city for 2 years, cutting off its supply lines, waiting for it to starve. And then something happened that no one in the city or anywhere else in Europe was prepared for. The Mongol army began to die, not from starvation, from something else, something that moved through their camp in a way that had no precedent in any military manual. And Jani Beg, recognizing that his army was disintegrating, made a decision. He loaded plague-ridden corpses onto his catapults and threw them over the walls of Caffair. An Italian notary named Gabriele de Musii witnessed what happened next. He wrote about it in a document that has survived to today. He described the bodies coming over the walls. He described the people of Caf, already starving, now watching their companions begin to develop the same symptoms as the corpses raining in from outside. He described the Genoese traders loading whatever they could onto their ships and fleeing, running from a siege they had endured for 2 years, running toward home, toward Italy, and carrying in the holds of their ships and the fur of the rats that travel with every cargo vessel in their own bodies and clothing. The single most catastrophic passenger in the history of European trade. In October of 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships reached the harbor of Messina in Sicily. By the time the ships arrived, most of the sailors were dead. The rest were dying, covered with strange black swellings. The buboes that gave the eventual disease its name in later centuries. The authorities of Messina ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately, but it was too late, and it would be too late everywhere, because the thing that had arrived on those ships was not just a disease. It was, and I want you to think about this very carefully, a disease perfectly engineered by accident for the trade road system we have spent this entire night exploring. Every mechanism we've discussed, every network, every hub, every inn and market and fair, every ship and cart and pack animal, every crowd of pilgrims and merchants and travelers gathered in close proximity, every single feature of the medieval trade road that made it so extraordinarily effective at moving goods and ideas and culture across a continent. Every single one of those features now became equally effective at moving something else entirely. Let's follow the path because it followed the trade routes with an almost geometric precision from Messina. It spread immediately to the other port cities of Sicily, then to the Italian mainland, Genoa, Venice, and the great trading cities of northern Italy by the turn of 1347 to 1348. From Italy, it moved along the coastal trade routes to the port of Marseilles, and from Merlies through France, along the roads. We've spent all night walking together to Paris. Paris reported 800 dead in a single day at the peak. 800 people in one city in one day. A ship from Killala carried it to the English port of Malcolm Regis in August of 1348. It reached Bristol almost immediately. London suffered most severely between February and May of 1349. East Anglia and Yorkshire through that summer. In Norway by 1349, arriving by ship. Sweden by 1350, from Crimea to the north of England in approximately 3 years. The same trade routes that had moved silk from Asia to Flanders in a matter of months now move something else with the same efficiency. Now, here's the thing about the Black Death that I find most haunting. And I say haunting deliberately because I think it's the word that fits. The people carrying it did not know they were carrying it. That is the detail that every single narrative of this period returns to. There was no way to know. You were a merchant who had been in Caf. You got on a ship. You were heading home. You were already sick, but you didn't know that yet. You landed in Messina. You went to an inn. You sat at a table with 15 strangers. You told them about the situation in Crimea, about the siege, about the strange illness in the Mongol camp. And then you went to bed. And the fleas that were living on the rats in the hold of your ship walked off the ship that night and into the grain stores of Messina. No malice, no knowledge, just the ordinary daily motion of commerce. Giovanni Boccaccio was in Florence when the plague arrived there in March of 1348. He survived it, and the description he wrote afterward in the introduction to his Dame is one of the most powerful pieces of eyewitness. Writing from the entire medieval period, he described what Florence looked like at the height of the plague, the dead being carried out of houses in the mornings, bodies laid outside on doorsteps because families no longer had the strength or will. Or I think this is the detail that breaks you the capacity for grief to bury them. People walking through the streets, holding flowers and scented herbs to their noses, not as decoration, as a desperate attempt to filter out the corrupted air that everyone believed was killing them. Fathers abandoning children, priests refusing to enter the houses of the dying, lawyers vanishing because there was no point in making wills when there might be no one left to inherit. Florence lost somewhere between 50,000 and its entire population. Mercato himself mentioned the impossible figure of 100,000. But modern historians estimate closer to half the city's 85,000 people. Half in one city in one season. Paris was reportedly burying 800 people a day in Siena. The chronicler Agnolo di Turo wrote that he buried 5 of his own children with his own hands. 5 children by his own account. Now, I want to step back from the individual tragedy for a moment, because as overwhelming as the human cost is, and it should overwhelm you, these were real people on roads we've been walking all night. There is something specific about the Black Death's relationship to the trade road that I think deserves its own attention. The plague did not spread randomly. It spread along the network, and the network was the medieval trade road system. When historians map the progression of the plague across Europe, what they see is a map of commerce. It follows the shipping lanes first, the fastest, most densely traveled routes, then the major land trade routes, then the secondary roads, the places that were most connected, most prosperous, most central to the trade road economy. They were hit first and hardest. The isolated communities, the small villages off the main routes, the settlements in the mountains, and the remote corners of Europe that the road had never quite reached. Some of them were barely touched. And here is the terrible irony that the medieval world could not have understood, and that we can now see clearly with 7 centuries of distance. The features of a society that made it economically successful: connectivity, movement, exchange, density of population and trading towns were exactly the features that made it vulnerable. The road had built a world of extraordinary prosperity and exchange, and then it delivered the bill. What happened after? Because this is where the story becomes, in its own dark way, genuinely strange. The Black Death killed, depending on the region, and the estimates you accept, between 30 and 60% of the European population in the space of 5 years. Between 1347 and 1352, the population of Europe would not return to pre-plague levels until around 1550. 200 years, 2 centuries of demographic recovery, and the immediate aftermath on the trade road was chaos. Yes, silence on the roads for a while. Markets empty, inns abandoned, routes that had buzzed with commercial life quiet for the first time in generations. But then something unexpected happened, something that historians have argued about ever since. In a longer term, the plague changed the economy of the medieval trade road in ways that were, for some of the people who survived it, genuinely transformative. With a third or more of the workforce gone, labor became scarce. And scarce labor in a medieval agricultural economy meant something very specific. Power shifted. The workers who survived, the laborers, the farmhands, the peasants who had spent generations tied to the land found themselves for the first time in something close to a position of negotiation. They could say, "If you don't pay me more, I'll go work for the Lord in the next town." And sometimes the Lord in the next town would pay more. This terrified the ruling class so thoroughly that the English crown passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels by law. It didn't entirely work because the market doesn't care what the law says when a market has moved. And here's the thought I keep returning to about this part of the story. The medieval trade road made the Black Death possible, or at least made it far worse than it would have been. The connectivity, the efficiency, the sheer human density of a commercial civilization built around the movement of goods and people created the perfect conditions for a pandemic. And the pandemic, in its own catastrophic way, rebuilt the road, changed who walked it, changed what they were walking toward, killed the old feudal certainties, opened up spaces economic, social, psychological that hadn't existed before. The survivors of the Black Death lived in a different world than their parents had, a world more uncertain, but also for some more fluid, more open. The merchant who survived and found all his competitors dead. The peasant who survived and found all the lords competing for his labor. The widow who survived and found herself running a business simply because everyone with more authority over her was gone. History has this bitter habit. Sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to a civilization is also the thing that cracks it open. We've come a long way tonight, you and I. From the dust of the roads at dawn to the toll gates and the end fires and the pilgrim songs and the women at the market stalls and the outlaws in the greenwood, and now to the silence that fell on those roads in 1348. The empty inns, the abandoned carts, the towns that were full of people one season and half empty the next. We've walked through almost everything that made the medieval trade road what it was. But there's still one more part of this story that I think is the most surprising of all, because we've spent most of tonight talking about the road's relationship with danger, hardship, commerce, and loss. What we haven't talked about is what the road actually created, not just economically, intellectually. The ideas that traveled along those roads, the knowledge that moved. Alongside the pepper and the silk and the wool ended up changing the shape of how human beings think. The story of what was learned on the medieval road and where that knowledge eventually led is one of the most quietly extraordinary things in all of Western history. And it's exactly where we're going next. Consider for a moment what happens when a young man follows his father to work. For most of history, this is how skills were passed down. Father to son, mother to daughter, master to apprentice, the whole accumulated knowledge of a craft transferred through proximity and practice. But occasionally, following your father to work puts you in a place that changes the world. Around the year 1170, a boy named Leonardo was born in Pisa, Italy. His father, Guglielmo, was a merchant, specifically a customs official station in Bugia, a trading post in what is now northern Algeria on the coast of North Africa. And when Leonardo was old enough, his father brought him there to the counting houses, to the port, to the place where East met West in the daily language of commerce. And what Leonardo Pisano encountered there, watching merchants from India and the Arab world conduct their calculations, was a system of numbers so elegant, so efficient, so entirely superior to anything Europe was using that he spent the next several decades of his life trying to convince everyone he knew about it. We call him Fibonacci today. The name is actually a 19th century invention. Historians' nickname derived from the Latin phrase meaning son of Bonacci. But whatever you call him, in 122 Leonardo of Pisa wrote a book that changed the intellectual history of Western civilization. He called it the Liber Aci, the Book of Calculation. And at its heart was a simple, radical proposition. Stop using Roman numerals. Start using the Hindu-Arabic system. From the numbers 1 through 9 plus 0, arranged in a place value system, where the position of a digit determines its value. The numbers we use today, the numbers children learn in the first week of school. Those numbers. Now, I want to pause here for just a moment, because I think this is the kind of thing that's so familiar we've lost our ability to feel how strange and revolutionary it actually was. Try to do this in Roman numerals. Multiply 37 by 48. In Roman numerals, that's 37 multiplied by 48. Now, write that out. Work through it. Medieval European merchants did this every day for centuries with actual Roman numerals on counting boards with physical tokens. It was slow, error-prone, and genuinely exhausting for anything more complicated than simple addition. Now write 37 by 48 in our modern system. 37 by 48. You did it in about 5 seconds, didn't you? That gap between what the Roman system could do and what the Hindu-Arabic system could do is the intellectual gap that the medieval trade road bridged. And it crossed that gap not through the work of scholars sitting in universities. It crossed it through the work of merchants. Here is the specific, beautiful, almost poetic truth about where Fibonacci got his education. He didn't get it in a library. He got it in trading ports. He traveled around the Mediterranean to Egypt, Syria, Greece, Sicily, Provence, meeting merchants, studying their mathematical methods, watching how they calculated exchange rates and profit margins and compound interest. The knowledge he accumulated and published in the Libra Abaci had been developed over centuries by Indian mathematicians, refined by Arab scholars, and was already in active use throughout the Islamic commercial world. It was traveling the trade route. It had been traveling the trade route for generations, and Fibonacci collected it, organized it, and put it in a book that was written specifically, deliberately, pointedly, not for scholars, but for merchants. The second section of the Libra Abaci is entirely devoted to commercial mathematics, currency conversion, profit calculations, measurement of weights and volumes, the calculation of interest, everything a traveling merchant needed to do on a daily basis now performed using a system that was faster, more accurate, and infinitely more scalable than anything Europe had used before. One of the great historians of science has called Fibonacci's contribution to modern finance as significant as the personal computer's contribution to the modern office. He didn't invent the tools. He packaged them. He made them available to the people who needed them. And within a generation, Italian merchants were calculating in the new system. Within a century, the new system had spread north through the trade routes to France and Germany. And within 3 centuries, the entire European commercial world had restructured itself around a mathematical foundation that had traveled from 5th century India to 9th century Baghdad to 13th century Pisa, carried not by scholars, not by governments, but by merchants on trade roads. But the numbers were only the beginning, because something else was traveling those roads alongside the wool and the spices and the letters of credit, something that the medieval church had specifically deliberately lost. The works of Aristotle and Plato and Galen and Euclid. This is a chapter of history that I find genuinely moving every time I think about it. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, much of the accumulated philosophical and scientific knowledge of the ancient Greeks was effectively lost to Western Europe. Not destroyed, lost. The manuscript still existed in Byzantium and Alexandria, in the great libraries of the Islamic world, where Arab scholars have been translating, preserving, and expanding on them for centuries. The Greek text of Aristotle's physics, his metaphysics, his work on the heavens and the soul. None of this was readable in Western Europe, because nobody could read Greek, and the Latin translations had mostly not survived. For several hundred years, Western European intellectual life operated in a kind of dimness. Brilliant people, limited access to the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. And then slowly, beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries, something started to happen. Scholars began appearing at the contact points between the Islamic and European worlds. In Toledo, Spain, a city that had been under Muslim rule and was now under Christian control, an extraordinary project began. Scholars, many of them traveling specifically to Toledo along the trade routes of the Iberian Peninsula, began translating Arabic manuscripts into Latin. Not just translating the Arabic originals, translating the Arabic translations of the original Greek. Aristotle's works on logic, physics, and metaphysics. Euclid's elements of geometry. The medical writings of the Persian physician Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became the standard medical textbook in European universities for the next 5 centuries. The astronomical work of Al-Battani, the optical theories of Ibn. One scholar, named Gerard of Cremona, traveled from Italy to Toledo specifically because he had heard there was an Arabic manuscript of Ptolemy Almagest. He found it, he learned Arabic, he translated it, and in the process he translated approximately 80 other scientific and mathematical works from Arabic into Latin. 81 man. Can I ask you something? What do you think motivated these scholars to make journeys of hundreds of miles, to learn entirely new languages, to spend years in foreign cities? The same thing that motivated the merchants. The conviction that what was on the other side of the journey was worth the road. The fundamental human restlessness that drove everyone who ever set foot on a trade route. The merchants wanted Peppa and profit. The scholars wanted Aristotle and Euclid. But they traveled the same roads. They stayed at the same inns. They crossed the same mountain passes and paid the same tolls. And what they brought back changed the world in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. Here's one specific way to feel the scale of what was transmitted. The word algebra comes from Arabic, specifically from the Arabic phrase al-jaba, meaning roughly the reunion of broken parts. It appears in the title of a 9th century work by the Baghdad mathematician Muhammad al-Khwarizmi. His name Latinized became the word algorithm. So the two most foundational concepts in modern computing algebra and algorithm are Arabic words. Words that entered European languages through the trade route, through the contact points at Toledo and Sicily and the ports of the Mediterranean, through the slow, patient centuries-long process of knowledge traveling alongside cargo. And then there was paper. This one always stops me. Paper was a Chinese invention. It had been in use in China since around the 2nd century, before the Common Era. It traveled west along the Silk Road to the Islamic world, where Muslim scholars and merchants adopted it enthusiastically in the 8th century, and then gradually through the trade networks we've been exploring all night paper entered Europe. The first European paper mills appear in Spain and Italy in the 12th and 13th centuries, located of course on or near the major trade routes. And paper changed everything, not immediately, but inexorably, because paper is cheap in a way that parchment, the prepared skin of animals, was never cheap. A scholar who wanted to copy a manuscript in the 10th century needed the skins of dozens of sheep. A scholar who wanted to copy a manuscript in the 13th century needed paper. Paper that cost a fraction of what parchment cost. Paper that could be produced in large quantities. Paper that made knowledge reproducible in a way it had never quite been before. And 2 centuries later, when Johannes Gutenberg assembled his printing press in around 1450, the technology that made the press transformative, that made it possible to print hundreds of identical copies of a text cheaply enough for ordinary people to buy, was paper, which had traveled from China to Europe on the trade road. I think about this chain sometimes when I'm trying to understand what a trade road actually is. Not just an infrastructure, not just a commercial system, but a technology for the transmission of a human experience. Every idea on that chain was carried by a person, a merchant, a scholar, a pilgrim, a traveler who encountered something on the road that they didn't have when they left home and who brought it back. The numbers used to calculate compound interest in a 14th century Venetian counting house had been developed in 5th century India. The medical knowledge used in a 12th century European hospital had been written by a Persian physician in 11th century Persia. The geometric proofs that formed the foundation of Renaissance architecture had been preserved in Arabic manuscripts in Toledo. All of it moving, all of it in motion along the same roads where the pepper and the wool and the pilgrims were moving. The trade road was not just an economic artery. It was the nervous system of a civilization. And along that nervous system traveled everything a civilization needs to be alive. We're almost at the end of this long night's journey together. We've walked through the mud and the toll gates and the inns and the markets. We've met merchants who built careers from nothing and outlaws who carved out kingdoms in the greenwood. We've watched a plague travel the roads we've been walking. We've seen women run economies that the record books forgot to mention. We've watched the numbers in your phone, the very system used to build the technology you're listening to me on right now. Travel from India to Baghdad, to a boy in a counting house in Bugia, to a book written in 122. And now there's just one more question left. The question I've been building toward all night. The question that when you really sit with it makes the medieval trade road feel less like ancient history and more like a mirror. What do all these roads, all these people, all this motion and commerce and exchange and loss and survival and transformation, what does it all actually mean? What did it build? And what can we still see of it if we know where to look? That's our final chapter, and it's one I've been looking forward to sharing with you since we first stepped onto the road together. Here's something I want you to try right now. Reach into your pocket or your bag, or wherever you keep the thing you use to pay for things. Check your messages, and navigate streets you've never been on before. You probably already know what I'm going to say, but stay with me, because I think there's a version of this that you've never quite seen before. That device in your hand, that screen, that chip, that extraordinarily complex piece of technology is in a way the final destination of everything we've been talking about tonight. Not metaphorically, literally. Let's trace it. The numbers used to build that device, the mathematical system that underlies every calculation it performs, are Hindu-Arabic numerals developed in 5th century India, refined by Arab mathematicians in 9th century Baghdad, carried to Europe by a merchant's son who followed his father to a trading post in North Africa in the 12th century. Published in a book written for merchants in 122, spread along the trade routes of medieval Europe over the following 2 centuries. The word algorithm, describing the process your device uses to make every decision, comes from the name of Al-Khwarizmi, a 9th century Baghdad mathematician. The word algebra, the mathematical foundation of every line of code, comes from the title of his most famous book, The Financial System That Funded the Technology Company That Built Your Device. Traces its lineage directly to the innovations of Italian merchant bankers in the 13th and 14th centuries. Double-entry bookkeeping, still the universal language of business accounting, has its first undisputed recorded example in the treasury accounts of the city of Genoa in 1340. The concept of limited liability, the legal structure that made large-scale corporate investment possible, that allowed technology companies to raise the capital to build the chips and the servers and the infrastructure that your device depends on, traces directly to the commoner contracts of the medieval Italian trade cities. The insurance system that underwrites the shipping containers bringing the raw materials for your device from one continent to another. The very concept of insurance as a financial product was invented by Italian merchants in the mid-4th century who needed to protect their cargoes on exactly the kind of trade routes we've been walking all night. The paper trail of global commerce, the bill of exchange that became the modern check, that became the electronic transfer, all of it has its origin in the practical needs of merchants trying to move money across distances without being robbed on the road. On that road, the muddy, dangerous, impossibly alive medieval trade road. Goethe, the great German writer of the 18th century, once had a character in one of his novels called double-entry bookkeeping, among the finest inventions of the human mind. He meant it as a slight exaggeration. He wasn't entirely wrong, because double-entry bookkeeping is not just a method of accounting. It is a system of trust. It says here's what came in and here's what went out, and both sides must balance. And if they don't, something is wrong, and we can find it. That logic, that insistence on balance, on transparency, on the ability to audit and verify, is the same logic that underlies every financial system in the modern world. Every stock exchange, every central bank, every accounting firm, every spreadsheet ever made. All of it tracing its lineage to the practical problem of a medieval merchant trying to keep track of what he had bought and sold across half a dozen countries with half a dozen different currencies. But I want to come back to something more human than banking systems and accounting methods, because we've spent 12 chapters tonight walking beside the people of the medieval trade road. And the thing I keep coming back to at the end of this long journey is not the institutions they built or the systems they invented. It's the courage they showed. The quiet daily, mostly unrecognized courage of ordinary people moving through an uncertain world. Think about who was on those roads. The peddler who started with a donkey and a pack of thread and spent years walking village to village in the cold accumulating knowledge. One conversation at a time, gradually building something from nothing. The merchant's wife who managed the entire business for 6 weeks every year, while her husband was at the champagne fairs, keeping the accounts, supervising the apprentices, making decisions in his absence that would affect the family's livelihood. The wife who brewed the drink that kept her village alive and paid her stall fees and was depicted in church murals as bound for hell and kept brewing anyway. The scholar who traveled 1,000 m to Toledo because he'd heard there was an Arabic manuscript of a book he needed to read. The pilgrim who had 14 children and failed at 2 businesses and negotiated a deal with her husband, and then set out for Jerusalem at the age of 40 alone because something in her said go. The merchant named Goderic, who started as a peddler with a donkey in Lincolnshire and ended up as a ship captain in the Mediterranean, and then gave it all away to sit in a forest near Durham and write songs. All of them on the same road, all of them making the same bet, that the world on the other side of the journey was worth the world in between. There is a specific quality that the medieval trade road seems to have selected for among the people who traveled it. Not wealth, not status, not even intelligence exactly, adaptability. The road rewarded the people who could read the situation they were actually in, not the one they planned for, and adjust. The merchant who could negotiate in 3 languages. The innkeeper who could read a room full of strangers and know which ones to trust and which ones to watch. The traveler who could tell from a glance at the sky and a conversation with the last person coming the other way whether the road ahead was safe or not. These were not dramatic skills. They were the quiet, practiced intelligence of people who had learned that the world does not stand still and wait for you to be ready. And I think that's why the medieval trade road built the modern world. Not because of any single invention, not because of any single person, but because it created and sustained a culture of movement, exchange, and adaptation across several centuries. A culture that learned collectively how to take risk and manage it, how to extend trust across distances where trust couldn't be verified in person, how to solve problems that had never been solved before, because problems that had never been solved before kept appearing on the road, and you either solved them or you went home. And here's the thought I want to leave you with tonight. The next time you check your bank balance, look at those numbers. The Hindu-Arabic numerals traveling from 5th century India to your phone screen in 700 years. The next time you pay for something with a card instead of carrying a bag of coins, think of the Italian merchant who invented that idea to avoid being robbed on the Alpine passes. The next time you read a news story about global supply chains or international trade agreements or the movement of goods across continents, understand that the logic of all of it, the entire architecture of how the world moves, things from where they are to where they're needed, was laid down by people on a muddy road in 13th century Europe. Walking, calculating, negotiating, trusting, building something bigger than any of them could individually see. The medieval trade road is gone now. The specific roads, many of them are paved over. Some are buried under modern highways. A few still exist as walking paths. And if you know where to look, you can occasionally find the deep hollowed channels of hollowways in the English countryside. Sunken lanes 8 centuries, old still bearing the shape of all the feet that walked them. The Champagne fair town, still Stand province, is still there, beautifully preserved a few dozen kilometers from Paris. You can walk through its stone cellars and stand in the space where merchants from Flanders and Italy once negotiated the price of cloth. The Via Franca, the ancient pilgrim road from Canterbury to Rome, is still walkable today. And every year, thousands of people walk it. Not for commerce, not out of obligation, but because, as it turns out, putting your body on the road is still one of the most human things you can do. The need to move, the need to arrive somewhere that matters, the need to find out what's on the other side of the next hill. That hasn't changed in 7 centuries. It hasn't changed in 7,000 years. And that, I think, is the real legacy of the medieval trade road. Not the numbers, not the banks, not even the knowledge that flowed from Baghdad to Toledo to Paris. The legacy is the human understanding passed down through centuries of merchant practice and pilgrim suffering and ordinary people doing extraordinary things in ordinary circumstances. That connection is worth the cost. That the risk of the road is worth the world it opens up. That the stranger you meet halfway between where you started and where you're going might be carrying something you need. That the exchange of goods, of ideas, of stories, of the small daily kindnesses between travelers is what civilization actually is. Not the walls, not the territories, the roads between them. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for walking this road with me tonight. We've covered a lot of ground together, you and I. We've been from the muddy lanes of medieval England to the sunlit stone cellars of Provence. We've paid tolls on the Rhine and eaten pottage and sook and listened to Marjorie Kemper weeping at the walls of Jerusalem. I hope some of it stayed with you. I hope the next time you walk down a street or check a spreadsheet, or read about global trade, some small part of this story flickers somewhere in the back of your mind. Because these were real people. They walked real roads, and in ways both large and small, they built the world you woke up in this morning. If you found value in this journey tonight, if any of these stories moved you or surprised you, or made you think the best thing you can do is share it with someone who might feel the same, leave a comment below and tell me which part of tonight's journey surprised you most. Was it the holloways? The Alouiv's Fibonacci learning his numbers in an Algerian trading post? The Falval brothers? I read every comment, every single one, and I love knowing which part of the road you remember most. There are many more roads to walk together. Many more stories from the places where ordinary people did extraordinary things in the long, quiet centuries before the world became the world we know now. We'll travel them together, one story at a time. Sleep well.